Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The walls breathe at 3:17 a.m. I know this with the certainty of a man who has spent 43 consecutive nights staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each creak, each whisper, each dragging sound that seeps through the plaster like water through rotting wood. The broker had promised me silence. He had stood in this very living room, gesturing toward the bare walls with the enthusiasm of a man earning commission, and assured me that the 8th floor was practically deserted. Perfect for a writer, he had said, his smile too wide, too rehearsed. You'll have all the quiet you need. I should have noticed the way his eyes avoided the wall adjacent to Unit 8B. The move from the small coastal town where I'd spent my entire adult life to this sprawling metropolitan maze had been an act of desperation disguised as ambition. My publisher wanted the manuscript in 6 months. My ex-wife wanted nothing to do with me. The ocean had started to feel less like home and more like a grave. I was slowly digging with my own indecision. So I packed what little I owned into cardboard boxes and drove 14 hours to a city where no one knew my name, where the anonymity of concrete towers and indifferent strangers seemed like the perfect balm for a fractured existence. The apartment itself was unremarkable in the way that all temporary spaces are unremarkable. White walls that had seen too many coats of paint, hardwood floors scuffed by the footsteps of tenants who had come before and would come after, windows that looked out onto other windows in an infinite regression of urban loneliness. I had furnished it sparingly, a desk for writing, a mattress on the floor because I couldn't be bothered with a frame, a single lamp that cast shadows longer than my doubts. It was enough. It was supposed to be enough. The sounds began on my 3rd night. At first, I dismissed them as the natural complaints of an aging building. Every structure has its own language, its own nocturnal vocabulary of settling foundations and contracting pipes. But these sounds were different. They had rhythm. They had intention. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing the length of the adjacent apartment. The scrape of furniture being dragged across bare floors, a couch perhaps, or a heavy wooden table, and beneath it all, threaded through the silence like a dark stitch, the murmur of voices too low to understand but too present to ignore. I told myself it was a neighbor, someone who worked night shifts perhaps, or an insomniac like myself finding strange comfort in rearranging their living space while the rest of the world slept. I told myself this even as I pressed my ear against the cold wall, straining to catch words that dissolved into static the moment I focused on them. I told myself this even as I noticed that the sounds always began at the same time. 3:17 a.m., never a minute earlier, never a minute later, and continued for exactly 47 minutes before stopping as abruptly as they had started. By the 2nd week, I had stopped writing entirely. The manuscript sat untouched on my desk, its cursor blinking like an accusation. My days became exercises in anticipation, hours spent waiting for the night to fall so I could press myself against that wall and listen. I started keeping a journal, not of my novel, but of the sounds. I documented their duration, their intensity, the subtle variations in pitch and tone that I convinced myself formed some kind of pattern. I mapped the footsteps, tracing their path across what I imagined to be an identical floor plan to my own. Living room to bedroom, bedroom to kitchen, kitchen to the bathroom, where they would pause for exactly 3 minutes and 22 seconds before resuming their circuit. I began to notice other things, small things, things that could have been coincidence if I still believed in coincidence. The temperature in my apartment dropped several degrees whenever the sounds began, a cold that seemed to emanate from the shared wall itself. My phone would lose signal at exactly 3:17, returning to full bars the moment the sounds ceased. Once, I woke to find my front door standing open, not unlocked, but open, though I had bolted it before bed and lived alone. The hallway beyond had been empty, silent, but I could have sworn I smelled something drifting from the direction of 8B. Something old. Something like dust and dried flowers and the faint, coppery undertone of rust. It was on the 37th night that I finally gathered the courage to investigate. I stood in the hallway at 3:15 a.m., my heart hammering against my ribs like something desperate to escape. The corridor stretched in both directions, identical doors spaced at identical intervals, the fluorescent lights humming their tuneless song. Unit 8B was directly to my left, its door indistinguishable from any other. Same brass numbers, same peeling paint, same brass knocker that no one in this building probably ever used. I pressed my ear against the wood. The sounds were clearer here, unfiltered by the wall. Footsteps, yes, but heavier than I had imagined. The drag of something across the floor. Not furniture, I realized now, but something softer, something that yielded. And the voices. God, the voices. They weren't speaking any language I recognized, but they carried meaning nonetheless. Emotions that bypassed comprehension and settled directly into the marrow of my bones. Grief, longing, and beneath it all, a desperate, clawing hunger. I knocked. The sound stopped instantly, as if a switch had been thrown. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own pulse. I waited, my knuckles still raised, my breath caught in my throat like a trapped animal. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out. I asked if anyone was there. I said I was the neighbor, that I had heard noises, that I wanted to make sure everything was all right. My voice sounded thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. The words of a man who didn't believe what he was saying but felt compelled to say it anyway. Still, nothing. I tried the doorknob. It was cold, not merely cool, but cold, the kind of cold that burns, and it turned easily in my hand. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from the hallway rather than merely exist in the absence of it. I didn't enter. I'm not sure what stopped me. Instinct, perhaps, or the sudden certainty that if I crossed that threshold, I would never truly leave. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, staring into that black void, and I could have sworn I saw movement within it. Not walking, not approaching, just shifting, like the darkness itself was breathing. I ran back to my apartment and didn't sleep until dawn. The building superintendent was a heavy-set man with tired eyes and the permanent expression of someone who had heard every complaint imaginable and found them all equally tedious. I found him in the basement the next morning, sorting through maintenance requests with the enthusiasm of a pallbearer. I told him about the sounds. I told him about the footsteps and the dragging and the voices. I told him about the temperature drops and the open door and the darkness that seemed to breathe. He listened without interrupting, his face betraying nothing, and when I finished, he simply sighed and reached for a binder on the shelf behind him. He showed me the building's occupancy records. Unit 8B was listed as vacant. It had been vacant since he started working here 12 years ago. Before that, according to the records, it had been vacant for at least another decade. The last registered tenant had moved out in the early 90s, leaving no forwarding address, no explanation, nothing but an empty apartment that subsequent owners had repeatedly tried and failed to rent. I asked him why. He shrugged. Every time someone showed interest, he explained, something would come up. A better offer elsewhere. A sudden change of plans. One potential tenant had made it as far as the doorway before backing out, claiming the apartment felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate what he meant by that. After a while, the building management had simply stopped trying. Some spaces, he said, didn't want to be occupied. I pressed him. I asked about the previous tenant, the one who had left in the 90s. He was reluctant to answer at first, deflecting with bureaucratic excuses about privacy and record-keeping. But I could see something in his eyes, a flicker of discomfort, perhaps even fear, and I kept pushing until he relented. There had been complaints, he admitted, similar to mine. Other residents on the 8th floor had reported sounds coming from 8B, sounds that had no business coming from an empty apartment. Footsteps, voices, the scrape of furniture being moved in the dead of night. One by one, those residents had moved out, citing various reasons that all amounted to the same thing. They couldn't stand to live next to whatever was in that apartment. I asked if anyone had ever gone inside. He looked at me for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Once, he said, a maintenance worker, about 5 years ago. The man had been sent to check the pipes after another resident complained about a strange smell coming from the walls. He had entered 8B with his toolkit and a flashlight, and when he emerged 45 minutes later, he was pale and shaking and refused to say what he had seen. He quit the next day, moved out of the city entirely, as far as the superintendent knew. I asked what the smell had been. He didn't answer. He just closed the binder and told me that if I wanted to break my lease, he could arrange it. I didn't break my lease. I should have. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to pack my boxes and leave this city and never look back. But rationality had long since ceased to govern my actions. The sounds had become an obsession, a splinter working its way toward my heart, and I couldn't leave without understanding what they were, what they meant, what they wanted. So I stayed, and I listened. The sounds continued their nightly ritual. 3:17 a.m., 47 minutes, always the same pattern. But they began to change in subtle ways. The footsteps grew heavier, closer to the wall, as if whoever was making them knew I was listening and wanted me to hear. The voices, once indistinct murmurs, began to coalesce into something almost recognizable. Syllables that hovered at the edge of comprehension like a word on the tip of the tongue. And sometimes, in the brief silences between footsteps, I could hear something else. A sound like breathing. Slow, measured, patient. Right on the other side of the wall, right where my ear was pressed. I started talking back. I'm not sure when it began. The days and nights had blurred into a single sleepless continuum. But at some point I found myself whispering to the wall, asking questions I didn't expect to be answered. Who are you? What do you want? Why won't you let me sleep? The night I first heard my name, I understood that something fundamental had shifted. It came during one of those silences, a whisper so faint I might have imagined it. My name, spoken in a voice that was somehow both unfamiliar and intimately known, like hearing your own voice on a recording and failing to recognize it. I pressed myself harder against the wall, my cheek flat against the cold plaster, and waited for it to come again. It did, clearer this time, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the apartment next door. It was coming from inside the wall. I spent the next 3 days tearing at the plaster with my bare hands. I told myself I was looking for pipes, for wires, for some rational explanation for the sounds that had colonized my nights. But I knew, even as my fingernails split and my palms bled, that I was looking for something else entirely. I was looking for the source, the truth, the thing that had been calling my name. What I found was a door, not a real door, not in any architectural sense, but an outline in the exposed framework, a rectangle of older wood set into the wall between my apartment and 8B. It had been plastered over, painted over, forgotten, but it was there. A door that connected the two spaces. A door that, according to the building plans I later consulted, had never existed. I haven't opened it. I tell myself I never will. I tell myself that some thresholds are meant to remain uncrossed, that whatever waits on the other side of that door is better left undiscovered. I tell myself this every night as I lie on my mattress, staring at the exposed wall, watching the way the shadows seem to gather around that hidden frame. But the sounds have changed again. The footsteps no longer pace the length of 8B. They stop at the wall, at the door, and they wait. And sometimes, in those moments before sleep finally claims me, I could swear I see the outline of that door shifting, bulging outward, as if something on the other side is pressing against it, testing its strength, waiting for the night when I finally give in to curiosity and pull it open. Last night, I woke to find my hand already on the hidden frame, my fingers tracing the edges of that impossible door. I don't remember getting out of bed. I don't remember crossing the room. But I remember the cold, that burning, impossible cold. And I remember the voice, clearer than it had ever been, whispering from the darkness on the other side. It said my name, and then it said something else, something that sounded like, "Welcome home." I moved my mattress to the far corner of the apartment this morning. I've covered the exposed wall with a blanket, though I know it changes nothing. I've started sleeping with the lights on, though the shadows still gather in ways that defy the physics of illumination. The superintendent was right. Some spaces don't want to be occupied, but I'm beginning to wonder if I'm the one doing the occupying, or if something has been occupying me all along, drawing me here, guiding me to this apartment, to this wall, to this door. I wonder if the sounds I've been hearing were never coming from 8B at all. I wonder if they've been coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside, somewhere I've been carrying with me since long before I moved to this city. I wonder if the thing behind the door has my face. Tonight, at 3:17 a.m., I will press my ear against that hidden frame one final time. I will listen for the footsteps, for the voices, for the whisper of my own name in a voice that might be mine. And I will make a choice, to open the door, or to leave this place forever, to embrace the mystery or to flee from it, to discover what waits in the hollow next door, or to spend the rest of my life wondering. The cursor on my manuscript blinks in the darkness, somewhere beyond the blanket, beyond the wall, beyond the door that should not exist. Something is pacing, waiting, breathing. And for the first time since I moved into this apartment, I realize I can no longer tell if the breathing I hear is coming from the other side, or from inside my own chest. Story 2. The fluorescent lights in the monitoring room flicker at 2:47 a.m. every single night. I've timed it. I've counted the seconds between the first stutter and the final dim pulse before they stabilize again. 11 seconds. Always 11. The mall's maintenance supervisor tells me it's just the backup generators cycling through their automated checks. But generators don't explain why the temperature drops exactly 3 degrees during those 11 seconds, or why the smell of old leather and gasoline seeps through the air vents like breath from a mouth that's been closed for decades. I took this job 8 months ago because the pay was decent, and the hours suited my insomnia. Security guard at Westbrook Plaza, a dying mall in a dying Midwest town where the anchor stores closed years ago, and the remaining tenants cling to their leases like barnacles on a sinking ship. During the day, I walk the corridors and nod at the elderly couples who use the climate-controlled hallways for their morning exercise. I watch teenagers loiter near the food court, spending nothing, buying time until their parents pick them up. Normal, mundane, almost boring, but the night shift is mine alone, and the parking structure is where normalcy goes to rot. The first time it happened, I convinced myself I was dreaming. 3 months into the job, around 3 a.m., I was cycling through the exterior cameras on the ancient security system. 16 grainy feeds arranged in a grid on monitors that probably predate my birth. Level P3, the lowest level of the underground parking structure, showed nothing unusual. Empty concrete, yellow-painted lines, the occasional oil stain spreading like a birthmark across the floor. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again. A car sat in space 47. It wasn't there a moment before. I rewound the footage, watching the timestamp crawl backward, and the car simply appeared between one frame and the next. No headlights sweeping down the ramp. No engine sound captured by the ambient microphones. 1 second, empty space. The next, a vehicle. It was a Chevrolet Bel Air, powder blue with white trim, chrome bumpers gleaming under the parking structure's sickly yellow lights. The kind of car my grandfather used to talk about with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. The license plate was partially visible, a faded yellow background with numbers I couldn't quite read, the registration sticker showing a year that made my stomach clench. 1957. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, my heart hammering against my ribs as I took the service elevator down to P3. The descent felt longer than usual, the numbers above the door counting down with agonizing slowness. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into silence so complete I could hear my own pulse throbbing in my ears. Space 47 was empty. No Bel Air. No tire marks. No indication that anything had ever occupied that rectangle of concrete, except the painted lines and a crack that spiderwebbed across the floor like frozen lightning. I stood there for several minutes, sweeping my flashlight across the level, illuminating nothing but shadows and support pillars and the distant glow of the emergency exit signs. When I returned to the monitoring room, the car was back on camera 12. Same space, same angle, same impossible vehicle from a decade before I was born. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The appearances became regular after that, though never predictable. Some nights, P3 remained stubbornly empty. Other nights, I'd count 6, 7, sometimes a dozen vehicles materializing in the lower levels. Always classic models, always with registration dates that belonged in history books. A 1962 Ford Galaxy with fins sharp enough to cut. A 1949 Mercury with custom flames painted along the hood, the kind of hot rod that greasers would have killed for. A pristine 1971 Plymouth Barracuda, its purple metallic paint catching the overhead lights in ways that made it look almost wet. I started keeping a log. Make, model, estimated year, space number, time of appearance. I photographed the monitors with my phone, though the images always came out blurred, the cars reduced to smears of color against the concrete backdrop, as if the cameras could capture them, but my phone refused to acknowledge their existence. My supervisor noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way my hands trembled slightly when I signed the shift logs. He asked if everything was okay at home, if I needed to talk to someone. I told him I was fine. What else could I say? That I was seeing ghost cars in the parking garage? That I spent my breaks researching automotive history, matching the vehicles I witnessed to production years and manufacturer specifications? That I'd found a 1954 Oldsmobile Rocket 88 in Space 23 last Tuesday, the same model involved in a fatal pileup on the interstate outside town 60 years ago? I didn't tell him any of that. Instead, I smiled, said I'd been having trouble sleeping, and accepted his recommendation for a new brand of melatonin. The sound started in my 5th month. I was making my rounds on P2, the mid-level of the structure, when I heard the first door. A metallic thunk, the unmistakable sound of a car door closing, echoing off the concrete walls and pillars. I spun toward the source, flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty spaces and the distant gleam of a fire extinguisher case. Another thunk, closer this time, to my left. I moved toward it, my footsteps too loud in the silence, my breathing ragged and harsh. The motion sensors mounted on the pillars, the same ones that triggered the overhead lights when legitimate vehicles entered, were flickering. Green lights blinking in sequence, tracking movement I couldn't see, following a path that led directly toward me. A third sound, not a door this time. An engine, the low, throaty rumble of something powerful, something built in an era when gasoline was cheap and horsepower was measured in bragging rights. It came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the structure until I couldn't tell if it was in front of me or behind me, or somehow inside my own skull. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I ran for the service elevator, jabbed the button until my finger ached, and rode back up to the monitoring room with my back pressed against the wall and my flashlight pointed at the doors like a weapon. When I checked the cameras, P2 was empty. No cars, no movement. The motion sensors showed green across the board, dormant and patient, waiting for something real to trigger them. But the audio logs, the ambient recordings that captured everything from rain on the roof to the occasional car alarm, showed something different. Spikes in the waveform, rhythmic patterns. I ran them through an audio program on my laptop, isolating the frequencies, cleaning up the static. Doors opening, doors closing, footsteps on concrete, and underneath it all, so faint I had to boost the gain until the speakers whined in protest. Voices, muffled, indistinct, like conversations heard through walls, through years, through the membrane that separates what was from what is. I couldn't make out words. I'm not sure I wanted to. The patterns revealed themselves slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. The appearances clustered around specific dates: the anniversary of the mall's groundbreaking in 1958, the date of its grand opening, the night a fire swept through the original surface parking lot before the structure was built. I found the newspaper archives online, digitized microfilm from the local historical society, brittle pages preserved in amber bites. The fire killed no one. The articles were clear about that, but it destroyed 37 vehicles, reduced them to skeletal frames, and melted rubber and ash that took weeks to clear. The mall's developers paved over the site, built the underground structure, buried the memory under 3 levels of concrete and rebar, and the relentless forward march of commerce. 37 cars. I started counting the ones I saw. A 1955 Studebaker Commander, a 1958 Edsel Citation, a 1961 Dodge Dart. Night after night, the numbers climbed, and with each new appearance, the sounds grew louder, the motion sensors more active, the temperature in the monitoring room colder, even when the thermostat showed 72 degrees. I was at 34 when I first saw the figure. It was a Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday. The nights blur together when you spend them watching shadows and listening for engines that shouldn't exist. The cameras showed a 1956 DeSoto Fireflight in Space 31, its distinctive fins casting shadows that stretched across the concrete like reaching fingers. I was cataloging it, adding the details to my log, when movement in the corner of the frame caught my attention. A silhouette, human-shaped, standing beside the driver's door. The camera resolution was too poor to make out features, but I could see the outline clearly enough. Broad shoulders, a hat, a fedora maybe, or a trilby, hands at its sides. It stood perfectly still, facing the camera, and even through the grain and static, I felt its attention like a physical weight, a pressure behind my eyes that made my vision swim. I watched for 11 seconds. The same 11 seconds the lights always flickered. Then the figure raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed. At the camera, at me. The feed cut to static. When it returned, the space was empty. The figure was gone, but the pointing gesture stayed with me, burned into my retinas like the afterimage of a flash, and I understood with terrible clarity that whatever was down there knew I was watching. And now it was watching back. I should have quit. Any reasonable person would have submitted their resignation, found another job, put as much distance between themselves and Westbrook Plaza as geography allowed. But something kept me coming back, something beyond the paycheck or the routine or the simple inertia of a life without many other options. I needed to know. I needed to understand. The 35th car appeared on a Friday, and when I saw it on the monitors, a 1953 Buick Roadmaster, black as a funeral suit, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight, my radio, my phone with its useless camera, and I took the elevator down to P3. The doors opened onto cold, not the chill of underground concrete, not the absence of heating in an empty structure, but cold as a presence, as a thing with mass and intent. My breath fogged in front of my face. Frost crept along the edges of the support pillars, delicate fractals that shouldn't exist in a climate-controlled space. The Buick was there, not on the camera this time. There, in front of me, solid and real and gleaming under the yellow lights. I could see the chrome details, the white wall tires, the dealer badge still affixed to the trunk. I could smell the leather interior through the slightly open window, mixed with cigarette smoke and something else. Something older. Something like earth after rain. I walked toward it. My footsteps echoed, but other footsteps echoed too. Out of sync with mine. A half beat behind. As if someone was following at a distance I couldn't measure. The motion sensors flickered green, then amber, then a red I'd never seen them display before, tracking movement in patterns that made no geometric sense. The Buick's door was ajar, just slightly, just enough to show darkness inside, a darkness deeper than the interior of any car should hold, a darkness that seemed to breathe. I reached for the handle. My radio crackled. Static at first, then something else. The same muffled voices from the audio logs, but clearer now, closer, speaking words I almost recognized in accents that belonged to another era. And underneath the voices, a question. repeated over and over in a tone that was almost welcoming. "Are you coming?" I pulled my hand back. The cold intensified, pressing against my skin like fingers, like dozens of fingers, urging me forward. The Buick's interior light flickered on, illuminating empty seats that somehow didn't look empty, that held the impression of bodies no longer there, the ghost of weight in worn leather. "Are you coming?" I ran, again, back to the elevator, back to the monitoring room, back to the world of flickering fluorescence and grainy camera feeds and a reality I could trust. When I looked at the monitors, P3 was empty, 35 spaces, all vacant, the Buick gone as if it had never existed. But the frost on my jacket was real, the smell of old leather in my nostrils was real, and the bruises on my wrist, 5 oval marks arranged like fingers, were real enough to photograph. Though when I showed them to the morning supervisor, he frowned and asked if I'd been sleeping well. I've stopped counting the cars. There's no point anymore. They come every night now, filling the structure with vehicles that burned 60 years ago, carrying passengers who might have been anyone, who might have been no one, who might be waiting still for a journey that never ended. The sounds are constant. Doors, engines, footsteps, voices, a symphony of the past bleeding into the present through concrete that should have kept it buried. The figure appears on multiple cameras now, different levels, different spaces, always watching, always pointing. Sometimes I see others with it, suggestions of forms in the static, faces that might be faces, hands pressed against windows from the inside. I've started hearing the question, even when I'm not in the structure. In my apartment, in my car, in the space between waking and sleep, where reality thins and other things slip through. Are you coming? I don't know what happens if I answer yes. I don't know what happens if I keep saying no. But every night, the cold gets closer. The frost appears on higher levels. The 37th car, I've never seen it, never cataloged it, waits somewhere in that structure, an empty space among the ghosts, a reservation that might have my name on it. The lights flicker at 2:47 a.m., 11 seconds. The temperature drops. And in the monitoring room, surrounded by screens showing things that can't exist, I wait for the shift to end, wondering if one night I'll walk down to P3 and never come back up. Wondering if I already have. Wondering if the man sitting in this chair, watching these monitors, writing these words, is the security guard who took this job 8 months ago, or something else. Something that answered the question wrong. Something that's been here much longer than it remembers. The cameras show P3. There's a car in space 37. It looks familiar. It looks like mine. Story 3. The fire was already burning when I arrived. I stood in the doorway of the cabin, my duffel bag hanging limp from my shoulder, and watched the flames twist behind the iron grate. Orange light licked the stone walls. The wood crackled and popped with the particular rhythm of a fire that had been burning for hours, not minutes. I checked my phone. 4:47 p.m. The property manager had assured me no one had accessed the cabin since the previous guest departed 3 days ago. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The smell hit me first. Cedar smoke, yes, but underneath it something else. Something floral and faintly chemical, like fabric softener or the lingering ghost of someone's perfume. The kind of smell that clings to spaces where people have lived. The cabin was supposed to have been cleaned, aired out, left sterile and waiting. Instead, it felt inhabited. The bed in the corner had been made with military precision, the white duvet pulled taut, pillows arranged in a careful pyramid. On the kitchen table, 2 plates sat facing each other, flanked by silverware and cloth napkins folded into intricate shapes. Swans, I realized. Someone had folded the napkins into swans. 2 wine glasses caught the firelight and threw it across the ceiling in dancing shards. I set my bag down slowly. Hello? My voice sounded wrong in that space, too loud and too small at the same time. The cabin absorbed it, gave nothing back. I walked to the table and touched one of the plates. Cold. The glasses were empty, but when I lifted one to my nose, I caught the faint sweetness of wine, a residue, a memory. I should have left then. I understand that now, looking back. But exhaustion has a way of dulling instinct, and I had driven 11 hours through rain and mountain roads to reach this place. I had paid for 3 weeks of solitude, 3 weeks away from the wreckage of my life back home, and I was not about to let some quirk of the cleaning service drive me back into the world I'd fled. I told myself the previous guest had set the table. I told myself the fire was some kind of automated system, a timer I hadn't been informed about. I told myself the smell was just the cabin's natural scent, accumulated over years of visitors. I told myself these things as I unpacked my bag, as I heated a can of soup on the propane stove, as I ate alone at a table set for 2. That first night, I slept poorly. The bed was too soft, the silence too complete. Several times I woke to the sensation of being watched, that primitive tickle at the base of the skull that our ancestors developed to survive predators in the dark. Each time I opened my eyes to find the cabin empty, the fire reduced to embers, shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. Around 3 a.m, I heard footsteps on the porch. I lay rigid beneath the duvet, listening. The sound was unmistakable, the creak of weight on old wood, the measured pace of someone walking. Back and forth, a patient patrol. I counted the steps. 14 one way, 14 back, 14 one way, 14 back. The rhythm never varied, never paused, never acknowledged that someone inside might be listening. I did not get up to investigate. I told myself it was an animal, a deer perhaps, or a raccoon exploring the porch. I told myself this even though no animal walks with such metronomic precision, such deliberate calm. I lay there until dawn began to gray the windows, and at some point during those endless hours the footsteps stopped. I cannot tell you when. My memory of that night has a quality of broken film, frames missing, the narrative jumping forward without my consent. The first hike seemed to help. I spent 4 hours climbing a trail that wound through pine forest and emerged above the tree line, where the world became rock and sky, and the cabin was invisible far below. The air was cold and clean, and for the first time since arriving, I felt the knots in my shoulders begin to loosen. I sat on a boulder and ate a sandwich, watching hawks ride thermals in lazy spirals. I thought about my apartment back in the city, the boxes I'd left half-packed, the phone calls I'd stopped returning. I thought about starting over, about the possibility of becoming someone new in this high, thin air. By the time I descended, the sun was low and golden, turning the forest into a cathedral of light. I felt good, tired, but good. The kind of tired that promises deep, dreamless sleep. The cabin door was standing open. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my heart suddenly loud in my ears. I was certain I had closed it, locked it, checked the lock twice before leaving. A habit, a compulsion. I always check locks twice. But there it was, swung wide, the interior dark beyond the threshold. I approached slowly, scanning the tree line for movement, finding none. The porch boards creaked under my boots, the same boards I'd heard creaking the night before. At the doorway, I paused and listened. Nothing, just the wind in the pines, the distant call of a bird I couldn't identify. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Fresh towels were stacked on the bathroom shelf. I had brought my own, hadn't asked for any. The bed had been remade in different sheets, a deep burgundy I didn't recognize. Hospital corners pulled so tight you could bounce a quarter off the surface. In the kitchen, groceries filled the previously empty refrigerator. Milk, eggs, cheese, vegetables, all the staples of a comfortable life. A bottle of red wine stood on the counter, uncorked and breathing. And in the closet, hanging in a neat row, were clothes. My clothes, or rather, clothes in my exact size, my exact style, but that I had never purchased, never owned. Flannel shirts in patterns I favored. Jeans with the same brand label I always bought. A jacket identical to one I'd donated to charity 3 years ago, right down to the frayed thread at the collar that I'd never gotten around to fixing. I stood before that closet for a long time, my hands shaking. The rational part of my mind, the part that had carried me through 42 years of ordinary life, was struggling to construct an explanation, a mistake with the reservations. Another guest's belongings left behind. A property manager who'd somehow accessed my purchase history and anticipated my needs with disturbing accuracy. None of these explanations held together. None of them accounted for the jacket, for the thread, for the particular worn softness of clothes that fit like they had been worn by my body, shaped by my movements. I grabbed my phone and called the rental company. The line rang and rang, then clicked to a voicemail box that was full. I tried 3 more times with the same result. I sent an email, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard, describing what I'd found, demanding answers. The message bounced back. Address not recognized. That night, I did not sleep at all. The photographs appeared on the 3rd day. I had left the cabin again, driven by an urge to escape those walls, that watching silence. I hiked farther than before, pushed myself until my legs burned and my lungs ached, trying to outrun the creeping dread that had settled into my bones. The forest offered no answers, only the indifferent beauty of a world that existed without reference to human fear. When I returned, the photographs were waiting. They were arranged on the mantel above the fireplace, a gallery of framed images that had not existed that morning. I approached them the way one approaches a snake, slowly, obliquely, ready to recoil. My reflection swam in the glass as I leaned in to look, and for a moment I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Me. Every photograph showed me, but not in any place I recognized, not in any moment I remembered. Me standing on a beach I had never visited, waves crashing white behind me, my face turned toward a sun I had never felt. Me sitting at a cafe table in what looked like Europe, a cappuccino in my hand, laughing at something outside the frame. Me leaning against a railing, mountains rising behind me, wearing the jacket from the closet, the jacket with the frayed thread, looking directly into the camera with an expression of intimate familiarity, as though I knew and loved the person taking the picture. In every photograph, I looked happy, relaxed, at ease in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. The me in those images was a stranger, living a life I had never experienced, surrounded by warmth and connection, and the simple peace of belonging somewhere. I picked up one of the frames, the beach scene, and turned it over. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, someone had written a date, June 15th, 2019. I had been in the hospital on June 15th, 2019, recovering from the car accident that had taken 4 months of my life and left scars I still felt in cold weather. I had been nowhere near a beach. I had been learning to walk again, struggling to remember the names of people who claimed to love me. The frame slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. I left the glass where it fell and searched the cabin. Every drawer, every cabinet, every possible hiding place. I found nothing, no hidden cameras, no evidence of forced entry, no explanation for the impossible gallery on the mantel. But in the bedroom closet, pushed into the back corner behind the clothes that fit me perfectly, I found a box. Inside the box were more photographs, hundreds of them, loose and unsorted, a cascade of images showing a life I had never lived. Me at birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, holiday dinners. Me with people I had never met, smiling for cameras I had never faced. Me aging through years that hadn't happened yet, gray appearing at my temples, lines deepening around my eyes, the slow accumulation of a future that hadn't arrived. Near the bottom of the box, my searching fingers touched paper. I pulled out a small envelope, cream-colored and expensive, the kind used for formal invitations. My name was written on the front in that same unfamiliar hand. I opened it with trembling fingers and extracted a single card. "We've been waiting so long for you to finally come home." I stopped hiking after that. I stopped leaving the cabin at all, afraid of what might change in my absence, what new impossibilities might materialize while I was gone. But staying didn't help. The photographs multiplied, appearing in new locations each morning, propped on the bathroom sink, tucked into my books, slid under my pillow like tokens from a secret admirer. The clothes in the closet rearranged themselves, favorites moving to the front as though someone had studied my preferences. The fire was always burning when I woke, no matter how thoroughly I extinguished it the night before. And the sounds began. At first, it was just the footsteps on the porch, that patient pacing in the darkness. But gradually, other sounds crept in. The murmur of voices too low to understand, drifting up from somewhere beneath the floor. The creak of a rocking chair that didn't exist, keeping time on the porch I was afraid to look at. Laughter sometimes, distant and distorted. The laughter of a party in another room. Celebration leaking through walls that should have contained nothing but insulation and pine. One night, I heard my own voice. It came from the kitchen, a low monologue I couldn't quite make out, the rhythm and cadence unmistakably mine. I lay in bed, paralyzed, listening to myself speak in a room I wasn't in. The voice was telling a story, something about a trip, a memory, the comfortable rambling of someone at ease with their audience. Occasionally, another voice responded, also too quiet to decipher, but warm, familiar, the voice of someone who knew me well. I pressed my hands over my ears, but I could still hear it. I could still hear myself, living a life that wasn't mine, in a place I had never been, with someone I would never know. This morning I found the mirror. It was hanging in the bathroom, replacing the small rectangle that had been there before. An ornate full-length affair with a gilded frame that belonged in a museum, not a mountain cabin. I stood before it, still in my sleeping clothes, and looked at my reflection. I looked terrible, gaunt and pale, dark circles under my eyes, the stubble on my jaw growing toward a beard I'd never intended to have. The cabin was destroying me, I realized. The fear, the sleeplessness, the constant assault on my understanding of what was possible. I was coming apart at the seams, and I didn't know how to stop it. But as I stared at my reflection, something shifted. The light changed, or my eyes adjusted, or reality itself took a breath and exhaled something new. The reflection in the mirror was still me, but different, healthier, well-rested, clean-shaven, wearing a shirt I didn't own, standing in a room that wasn't the cabin's cramped bathroom. Behind my reflection, I could see a window, and through the window a garden in full bloom, flowers in colors I couldn't name, a fountain catching sunlight, a life of beauty and peace stretching out beyond the glass. And in the corner of the reflection, just at the edge of my vision, I saw movement. Someone approaching, someone reaching out, their hand almost touching my reflected shoulder, their face just about to come into view. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the mirror showed only the cabin, only me, only the haggard stranger I was becoming. But I could feel it now, that other life, pressing against the membrane of reality like a hand against a window. I could feel the warmth of it, the love, the belonging I had never found in 42 years of searching. We've been waiting so long for you to finally come home. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe the isolation and stress have broken something in me, allowed the rational architecture of my thoughts to collapse into delusion and wish fulfillment. Maybe there is no presence in this cabin, no watching eyes, no impossible photographs, only a man coming undone in the silence, constructing an elaborate fantasy of being wanted, because the alternative is facing how thoroughly unwanted he has always been. Or maybe there is another world, running parallel to this one, where I made different choices and became a different man. Maybe that world has found a way to reach through, to call me home, to show me the life I was supposed to live. Maybe the cabin isn't haunted by ghosts, but by possibilities, by the weight of paths not taken, by the desperate reaching of a self I never got to be. I don't know which is true. I don't know if either is true. All I know is that tonight, when the footsteps begin their patient pacing on the porch, I'm going to open the door. I'm going to look into the darkness and see what's been waiting for me all along. Maybe it will be nothing. Maybe it will be everything. I packed my bag this morning, thinking I would leave. But the bag sits unopened by the door, and the fire is burning, and the table is set for two, and somewhere just beyond my hearing, someone is calling my name. I think I've always known this place. I think I'm finally ready to remember. Story 4. The static has a voice tonight. I've been a ham radio operator for 11 years, and in all that time, I've learned one fundamental truth about the airwaves. They never truly sleep. Even in the deadest hours of night, between 2 and 4 a.m., when the world holds its breath and the electromagnetic spectrum grows thin, there's always something. Distant maritime signals bouncing off the ionosphere, truckers on long hauls through empty highways, the occasional insomniac broadcasting poetry into the void. But tonight on frequency 7.215 megahertz, a band that should be nothing but cosmic noise, there is a voice, and it knows my name. I need to explain what I mean by dead frequency. Every amateur radio operator has their hunting grounds, the bands they return to night after night like fishermen to familiar waters. Mine has always been the forgotten spaces, frequencies allocated decades ago to services that no longer exist, channels assigned to agencies that have been absorbed, restructured, or simply ceased to be. There's a particular pleasure in tuning through these abandoned corridors of the spectrum, listening to the whispers of ionospheric propagation, the occasional burst of interference from a distant storm. It's archaeology of the invisible. The house settles around me as I adjust the dial. My radio room occupies what used to be a sun porch on the eastern side of the house, all windows facing the Atlantic 3 blocks away. I can smell the salt even with the windows closed, that persistent brine that seeps into everything in a coastal town. The equipment glows in the darkness, the amber display of my transceiver, the green sweep of the spectrum analyzer, the red pilot lights of amplifiers I rarely use anymore. I've turned off the overhead light hours ago. I prefer it this way, swimming in the soft luminescence of machines. The voice came at 3:17 a.m. At first I dismissed it as skip, radio signals bouncing off the ionosphere from thousands of miles away, a phenomenon that can make distant transmissions suddenly audible in unexpected places. The words were fragmented, buried in static, and I assumed I was catching the edge of some conversation happening in another hemisphere. But then the static cleared, just for a moment, like a curtain being drawn back, and I heard my full name. Not my call sign, which is public record, available in any amateur radio database. My legal name, the one that appears on my driver's license, on the deed to this house, on the tax returns I file each April. I sat frozen, my hand still on the tuning knob, the coffee in my mug growing cold. The voice was male, middle-aged from the timbre, and carried a quality I can only describe as flat. Not emotionless, exactly, but compressed, as if all the natural variations of human speech had been ironed out into something uniform and unsettling. It repeated my name twice, then fell silent. The static returned, that cosmic hiss that sounds like the universe breathing. I told myself it was a coincidence. Names overlap. Perhaps someone, somewhere, was calling out to a friend or family member who happened to share my name. The ionosphere plays tricks at night, bending signals around the curve of the Earth in ways that defy prediction. I've heard conversations from Japan, from Argentina, from ships in the middle of the Pacific. A matching name was improbable, but not impossible. Then the voice returned and described my house. The blue shutters that need repainting, the crack in the front step I've been meaning to fix for 3 summers, the wind chime made of old spoons that my late wife hung by the kitchen door before she left for that hospital stay she never returned from. Details piled upon details, each one landing like a stone in still water, sending ripples of unease spreading through me. The voice spoke without emotion, cataloging features of my home with the clinical precision of an insurance adjuster assessing property damage. I should have turned off the radio. Any reasonable person would have. But there's something about the airwaves that compels listening, a hypnotic quality to the crackling voices that emerge from the ether. Instead, I reached for my logbook, a habit so ingrained it's nearly autonomic, and began to write down what I was hearing. The handwriting doesn't look like mine when I review it now. The letters are too angular, pressed too hard into the paper. The voice mentioned the shirt I was wearing. Gray, cotton, with a small hole near the left hem where I'd caught it on a doorknob 3 weeks ago. It mentioned the empty mug beside my elbow, the one with the faded logo of a radio club that disbanded in 2019. It mentioned the way the moonlight was falling through the window behind me, casting my shadow across the equipment in a shape that, according to the voice, resembled a man kneeling in prayer. I looked at my shadow. It did resemble that, now that the observation had been planted in my mind. The shape of my hunched shoulders, the angle of my bent head as I leaned toward the receiver. A man in supplication to something vast and unknowable. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, though the thermostat hadn't changed. I could see my breath now, small clouds of vapor that hung in the air before dissolving. This was impossible. It was August, the night warm and humid, the air conditioning struggling to keep up with the coastal heat. Yet here I was, shivering, watching my exhalations form ghosts in front of my face. I grabbed the microphone and keyed the transmit button, demanding to know who was speaking. My voice sounded thin and unconvincing even to myself, a man shouting into a cathedral and hearing only the echo of his own fear return. The frequency offered nothing but static in response. I tried again, this time with my call sign, following proper protocol as if adhering to regulations might somehow restore order to what was happening. Still nothing. The voice had retreated into whatever fold of the spectrum it had emerged from. The next morning, I began researching frequency 7.215 megahertz. What I found kept me awake for the following 3 nights. The frequency had once been assigned to a coastal emergency coordination station, part of a network established in the 1970s to provide backup communication during hurricanes and other disasters. The station was located 14 miles up the coast from my town, housed in a concrete bunker near a lighthouse that had been automated years before. It operated for decades without incident, staffed by rotating crews of 2 operators who would monitor weather patterns and relay messages between emergency services when storms knocked out conventional communication. In 1987, the station went silent. According to the official records, newspaper archives digitized and buried in the back pages of library databases, there was an incident during a September storm. The details were frustratingly vague. One operator was found wandering the beach the next morning, hypothermic and incoherent, speaking in a language no one could identify. The other was never found. The station was decommissioned immediately, its equipment removed, its frequency reassigned and then forgotten, as technology advanced and rendered such installations obsolete. I drove out there on the 3rd day, telling myself I was simply indulging curiosity. The bunker was still standing, though the door had been welded shut decades ago, and the concrete walls were now canvases for faded graffiti. The lighthouse beside it was automated, its beams sweeping mechanically across waters that had claimed countless ships over the centuries. I walked the perimeter of the bunker, photographing the structure with my phone, feeling absurdly like a detective in a mystery I didn't understand. That night, the voice returned. It commented on my visit. It described the route I had taken, the songs I had listened to on the car radio, the way I had paused at a gas station to buy a bottle of water that I'd forgotten in the cup holder. It knew that I had touched the bunker's wall, running my palm across the rough concrete, as if expecting to feel something thrumming beneath the surface. It knew I had looked up at the lighthouse beam and thought of my wife, of the way she used to say that lighthouses were the loneliest buildings in the world. I found myself responding out loud, not into the microphone, but to the room itself, asking questions that dissolved into the static without acknowledgement. Who are you? How do you know these things? What do you want? The voice continued its monologue, ignoring my interruptions, cataloging details of my day with the thoroughness of a surveillance report. Then it said something that made me stop breathing. It described a dream I'd had the night before, a dream I hadn't told anyone about because there was no one left in my life to tell. My wife in a small boat, rowing away from shore, her back to me as I called her name. The water smooth as glass, the sky a color that doesn't exist in waking life. She never turned around, just kept rowing toward a horizon that receded with each stroke, maintaining the distance between us no matter how loudly I screamed. No one could know that. No surveillance technology, no hacked device. No amount of observation could extract the contents of a sleeping mind. Yet the voice knew. It knew, and it kept talking, moving from the dream to my childhood, to memories I hadn't thought about in decades, to moments of private shame and secret joy that had never been spoken aloud. I began to question my sanity. This is, I've since learned, a predictable response to impossible phenomena. The mind, confronted with information it cannot process, turns inward, seeking explanations in malfunction rather than mystery. I considered the medications I take. Nothing that should cause hallucinations, but chemistry is complex and individual. I considered stress, grief, the loneliness of a widower approaching 60 in a house too large for one person. I considered the possibility that I had simply imagined the voice, that the static I was hearing was being shaped by a mind desperate for connection into words that weren't really there. But the logbook remained, pages of transcription in my own increasingly unsteady hand, documenting conversations that couldn't have happened. I began recording the frequency, running digital captures throughout the night, even when I wasn't listening. The recordings showed nothing but static. Whatever the voice was, it existed only in real time, only for my ears, refusing to leave evidence of itself behind. A week passed. I stopped sleeping properly, which is to say I stopped sleeping at all. I would doze in the chair beside the radio, snapping awake at the slightest variation in the static, certain the voice was about to speak again. My appetite disappeared. I stopped answering phone calls from the few acquaintances I maintained. The house took on a quality of suspension, as if it too were waiting for something to happen. The voice began appearing on other frequencies. At first it was only adjacent bands, close enough that I could rationalize it as signal bleed. Then it spread further, emerging from frequencies it had no business occupying, interrupting maritime weather broadcasts and distant shortwave stations with my name, my address, descriptions of what I was doing at that exact moment. I would spin the dial desperately, searching for silence, and everywhere I landed, the voice would find me, patient and persistent, speaking in that flat tone that made my skin crawl. I've started to see patterns I'm not sure are real. The way the light falls through my windows now seems deliberate, arranged, as if the sun itself were participating in whatever surveillance has targeted me. I catch glimpses of figures at the edges of my vision, shapes that dissolve when I turn to look directly at them. The walls of my radio room have developed a quality I can only describe as attentive, as if the structure itself were listening. Last night, the voice told me something new. It said that frequency 7.215 megahertz was never truly dead. It said that the operator who disappeared in 1987 had discovered what the voice called the other spectrum, a band that exists beneath or alongside or within the electromagnetic frequencies we know, carrying transmissions that were never meant for human reception. It said that by listening so intently to dead frequencies, I had made myself audible to things that live in the static. It said they were grateful to finally have someone to talk to. I don't know what to believe anymore. The rational part of my mind, the part that spent 4 decades as an engineer, that understands signal propagation and radio physics and the explainable mechanics of electromagnetic radiation, insists that none of this is possible. Voices require sources. Information requires observation. The dead don't broadcast and the airwaves don't remember. But another part of me, the part that has always been drawn to the forgotten frequencies and abandoned channels, whispers that rationality is just another kind of static, that there are more things in the spectrum than are dreamt of in our technical manuals, that my wife might be out there somewhere, rowing toward a horizon I could reach if I just found the right frequency. I'm writing this account because I need something solid, something external to my own increasingly unreliable perception. The voice has gone quiet for the past 6 hours, the longest silence since this began, and I don't know if that means it's over or if it's merely gathering itself for something more. The radio beside me hums with potential energy. The dial glows amber in the darkness. Somewhere in the static, something is waiting. I should turn it off. I should walk away from this room, from this hobby that has consumed my nights for over a decade. I should sell the equipment, fill the silence with television noise and internet distractions, become a normal person who doesn't spend the small hours listening to the universe breathe. But I won't. Because 3 nights ago, Buried in the static between the voices' transmissions, I heard something else. Just for a moment. Just a fragment. My wife's voice, calling my name from very far away. And tonight, I'm going to find her frequency. Story 5. The house exhaled when I first stepped inside. A long, settling groan that traveled through the floorboards and up through my legs like a warning I chose to ignore. I had found the listing online, buried deep in a forum for people seeking cheap rural rentals. The photographs showed a 2-story Victorian with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle like a tired smile. The rent was absurdly low. The landlord, an elderly woman who lived 3 towns over, had been eager, perhaps too eager, to hand over the keys. She mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving suddenly, mid-lease, but I was too desperate to ask questions. My divorce had gutted my finances, and my therapist had suggested a change of scenery might help with what she delicately called my intrusive thought patterns. Small town, fresh start, quiet life. The realtor's promises echoed in my mind as I stood in the foyer that first evening, watching dust motes drift through slanted October light. The house smelled of old wood and something else, something faintly organic, like soil after rain, or meat left too long in a warm room. I told myself it was just the mustiness of a place that had sat empty. I told myself a lot of things in those early days. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked my boxes, arranged my modest furniture, and began establishing the routines my therapist had recommended. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks through the town's 3-block downtown, evening reading by the fireplace I was too nervous to actually light. The locals were pleasant but distant, offering tight smiles and short conversations that always seemed to end abruptly, as if they were late for appointments they couldn't name. I discovered the door on my 8th day. I had been searching for the circuit breaker after a power surge knocked out the lights in the kitchen. My flashlight beam swept across the hallway beneath the stairs, illuminating a section of wall I had somehow never noticed, or perhaps had noticed and immediately forgotten, the way the mind sometimes refuses to register things it finds uncomfortable. The door was set deep into the wall, nearly flush with the surrounding wood paneling. It might have been invisible if not for the boards nailed across it, 5 thick planks of unfinished pine, each one secured with what looked like dozens of nails, their heads rusted to the color of dried blood. 3 padlocks hung from hasps bolted directly into the frame, their keyholes clogged with corrosion. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Old coal cellar, unsafe structure, previous owner's eccentricity. But something deeper, something that lived in the basement of my own consciousness, recognized the desperate quality of that barricade. This was not a door that had been sealed to keep something out. This was a door that had been sealed to keep something in. I mentioned it to my landlord during our next phone call, keeping my voice carefully casual. There was a pause, just a beat too long, before she responded. "Storage area," she said, structurally unsound. "Best to leave it alone." When I pressed for details, asking about the excessive locks, the conversation developed sudden static, and she apologized and hung up. That night, I heard the first sound. It came at 3:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I had been staring at my phone, willing myself back to sleep after a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. A single knock, muffled but distinct, rising up through the floor from somewhere beneath me. I held my breath, waiting. Silence stretched like taffy, seconds becoming minutes. Just as I began to convince myself it had been a settling pipe or a branch against the foundation, it came again. 3 knocks this time, deliberate and evenly spaced. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. The sounds continued over the following days, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always when I was alone and vulnerable in that particular way that only deep night can produce. Sometimes it was knocking, patient, rhythmic, like someone tapping out a code I couldn't decipher. Other times it was footsteps, heavy and slow, pacing back and forth beneath me in a space that supposedly contained nothing but dirt and crumbling stone. And sometimes, worst of all, it was scratching. a persistent, methodical sound like fingernails dragging across wood, like something trying to claw its way through from the other side. I began sleeping with the lights on. Then I stopped sleeping altogether. The town's small library became my refuge during daylight hours. I told myself I was researching the house's history, but really I was simply afraid to be alone with it. The librarian, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me, watched me flip through property records and old newspapers with an expression I couldn't read. When I finally asked if she knew anything about my rental, she set down her glasses and studied me for a long moment. "That house has had a lot of tenants," she said carefully. "None of them stay long." I pressed for more, but she shook her head and returned to her work, leaving me with a stack of water-damaged documents and a growing sense of dread. The records revealed little concrete. The house had been built in 1887 by a man whose name had been partially obscured by water damage. I could only make out the first initial, a capital H. There were references to a domestic tragedy in 1923, but the relevant newspaper pages had been removed, leaving only ragged edges in the bound volume. The property had changed hands 17 times in the following century, an unusually high turnover that the documents never explained. One detail did stand out: a building permit from 1952 for basement remediation and permanent structural sealing. The attached notes were sparse but suggestive. Space to be rendered inaccessible per owner request. Contents to remain undisturbed. Contents. I began to watch the door. Not intentionally at first. I would simply find myself standing in that dim hallway beneath the stairs, my eyes tracing the grain of those rough pine boards, the constellation of nail heads, the dull gleam of the padlocks. The smell was stronger there, that organic undertone I had noticed on my first day. It seemed to pulse from the gaps between the boards like breath, warm and vaguely sweet, and deeply wrong. My therapist, during our video sessions, expressed concern about my fixation. She suggested I was projecting my anxiety onto the house, creating an external threat to distract from my internal turmoil. I nodded and agreed, and scheduled our next appointment, and that night I pressed my ear against the sealed door and listened. The sounds were clearer there, not just knocking and footsteps, but something else, a low, arrhythmic vibration that I felt in my teeth more than heard with my ears. And beneath that, so faint I might have imagined it, a voice. Not words exactly, but the shape of words, the intention of speech, muffled by wood and earth and decades of silence. I began to dream about the door. In the dreams, it was always open, revealing stairs that descended into perfect darkness. I would stand at the threshold, knowing I should not go down, knowing something waited for me in that darkness, and yet my feet would move of their own accord, carrying me down step by step into a cold that felt like drowning. I always woke before reaching the bottom, my sheets soaked with sweat, my throat raw as if I had been screaming. The scratching grew louder. Some nights it was almost frantic, a desperate scrabbling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, beneath me, behind me, inside the walls themselves. I would pace the house with a flashlight, checking corners and closets, finding nothing but shadows and my own reflection in darkened windows, looking back at me with hollow eyes. It was during one of these nocturnal patrols that I noticed the marks. The hallway light had been flickering for days, and I had finally replaced the bulb, flooding that narrow space with harsh illumination for the first time since I'd moved in. That's when I saw them. Gouges in the wood around the doorframe, deep parallel scratches that ran along the edges of the boards, concentrated around the gaps where they met the door beneath. I crouched down, tracing the marks with trembling fingers. The wood was splintered outward, the scratches all oriented the same direction, not toward the door, but away from it. Not scratches made by someone trying to get in, scratches made by someone trying to get out. The realization hit me like cold water. Whoever, whatever, had been sealed behind that door had tried to escape, had clawed at the wood from the inside, had fought against their imprisonment, had left these desperate marks as a record of their struggle, and now, decades later, they were still there, still knocking, still pacing, still trying to be heard. I should have left. Any reasonable person would have packed their bags and driven away and never looked back. but something held me there. Curiosity, perhaps, or the stubborn refusal to believe in things that shouldn't exist. Or maybe something else, something that had been growing in me since I first set foot in that house. A compulsion I couldn't name or resist. I went to the hardware store the next morning and bought a pry bar. The boards came away easier than I expected, the old nails surrendering to my leverage with high-pitched shrieks. I worked methodically, plank by plank, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The smell grew stronger with each board I removed, that sweet organic rot, thick enough now to taste. Behind me, the house seemed to hold its breath. The padlocks were more difficult. I had to make 3 trips to the hardware store before I found bolt cutters strong enough to slice through the corroded shackles. Each one fell away with a heavy clunk, and with each one I felt the weight of decades lifting, a seal being broken that should never have been disturbed. The door itself was older than the boards, made of thick oak gone gray with age. The handle was tarnished brass, cold beneath my palm. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hand on that handle, listening to the silence that had fallen over the house, a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Then I pulled. The door swung open on hinges that made no sound, revealing a rectangle of darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. Stone steps descended into that darkness, worn smooth in the center by countless footsteps. The smell that rose up was overwhelming, earth and decay and something else, something that made my lizard brain scream at me to run. I didn't run, I descended. The basement was larger than it should have been, the dimensions wrong in ways I couldn't articulate but could feel, as if the space had been bent or stretched by some force beyond geometry. My flashlight illuminated stone walls covered in what looked like scratch marks, thousands of them, layer upon layer of desperate gouges that formed patterns I refused to examine too closely. The floor was packed earth, and in the center of that floor was a chair, an old wooden chair facing the stairs, facing the door, as if someone had sat there day after day, year after year, watching that door, waiting for someone to open it. The chair was empty. I swept my flashlight around the space, searching for anything else, any sign of what had been kept here, any explanation for the sounds that had driven me to this moment. The beam passed over the walls, the floor, the chair, and then in the far corner something that made my breath stop in my throat. A mirror. A tall oval mirror in an ornate frame, its surface black with age and grime. And in that mirror, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach, a reflection that wasn't mine. A figure standing where the chair should have been, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but could feel. A gaze that pressed against my mind like fingers probing for entry. The figure raised one hand, slowly, and I watched in the mirror as it reached toward me. I dropped the flashlight. In the darkness, I heard breathing, not my own. I ran, up the stairs, through the door, through the house, out into the night air that tasted like salvation. I kept running until I reached my car, and I didn't stop driving until I was 3 counties away, shaking so badly I had to pull over or risk driving into a ditch. I never went back. I called the landlord from a motel room and told her I was breaking the lease. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She just gave me an address to mail the keys and hung up without saying goodbye. It's been 4 months now. I've moved to a city, surrounded myself with people and noise and light. I've told my therapist about that night, and she's helped me construct a framework for understanding it. Stress-induced hallucination, she calls it. Temporary psychotic break, triggered by isolation and anxiety. The mind playing tricks. I want to believe her. But sometimes in the small hours of the morning, I still hear it. A knock, soft and patient, coming from somewhere I can't identify. And sometimes, when I pass a mirror in dim light, I see something standing just behind me, a figure that isn't there when I turn around. And sometimes I wonder, did I open that door, or did that door open me? The scratching continues, only now, it seems to come from inside my own skull, like fingernails dragging across the bone, like something trying to claw its way out. I've started sleeping with the lights on again. It doesn't help. Story 6. The fluorescent light above the reception desk flickered twice before settling into its usual anemic hum. I had been watching it for the past hour, counting the seconds between each sputter, because that was the kind of thing you did when you worked the graveyard shift at a roadside motel in the middle of nowhere. You found patterns in meaningless things. You invented ways to stay awake. It was my first night covering for the regular guy, some emergency with his mother, the day manager had said, her voice carrying that particular weariness of someone who had stopped caring about explanations years ago. She handed me a laminated sheet with instructions, pointed at the ancient computer monitor behind the counter, and left without looking back. The pay was decent. The job was simple. Watch the desk, answer the phone if it rings, don't bother the guests. The motel was called the Wayfarer's Rest, though the neon sign outside had been dying for so long that it now read, The Way Airs RST, which somehow felt more honest. It was the kind of place that existed purely out of necessity. A cluster of concrete and stained carpet positioned exactly where exhaustion met desperation on a long stretch of highway between cities that mattered. By midnight, I had checked in exactly 2 guests, a truck driver who smelled of diesel and old coffee, and a woman in a business suit who looked like she had been crying recently, but was determined to pretend otherwise. Both took rooms on the 2nd floor. Both disappeared into the elevator without a word beyond the necessary transaction. I spent the next 2 hours reading a paperback I had brought, some thriller that promised twists I could see coming from chapters away. The lobby was quiet except for the hum of the vending machine in the corner and the occasional whisper of cars passing on the highway outside. The windows were tinted, turning the headlights into smeared yellow ghosts that swept across the walls and vanished. At 2:47 a.m., the elevator moved. I noticed it only because the ancient machinery made a sound like a tired sigh whenever it operated, a wheeze of cables and pulleys that seemed to echo through the entire building. I glanced up from my book, watching the brass arrow above the elevator doors. It was pointing at the lobby. Then slowly, it began to climb. 1, 2, 3. It stopped at 3. I stared at the indicator for a long moment, waiting for it to move again. It didn't. After perhaps a minute, I heard the distant sound of doors opening, then closing, then nothing. I turned back to my book, but the words had become meaningless shapes. I kept glancing at the elevator. The arrow remained fixed at 3. The 3rd floor was empty. I knew this because I had checked the system 3 times already that night, partly out of boredom and partly because the interface was so outdated that navigating it felt like solving a puzzle. 12 rooms on the 3rd floor, all vacant, all marked in the same pale green that indicated availability, and yet someone had gone up there. I told myself it was a glitch. Old buildings had old systems, and old systems did strange things. The elevator probably triggered automatically for maintenance reasons I didn't understand. Or maybe one of the guests from the 2nd floor had pressed the wrong button and gotten off before realizing their mistake. There were explanations. There were always explanations. I went back to my book. At 3:02 a.m., the elevator returned to the lobby. The doors opened with their usual reluctant groan, revealing an empty car. The light inside flickered once, just once, before the doors closed again. I did not go back to my book. Instead, I found myself pulling up the security camera feed on the monitor beside the computer. The system was as ancient as everything else in this place, displaying grainy black and white footage across a grid of 12 small squares. Most showed empty hallways and stairwells. One showed the parking lot, where only 4 cars sat beneath the sickly orange glow of the single working lamppost. And 3 of them, cameras 7, 8, and 9, showed the 3rd floor. The hallway was empty. Of course it was empty. 12 doors, 6 on each side, all of them closed. The carpet was that industrial pattern designed to hide stains, and the walls were painted a color that might have been beige or might have been gray, depending on how much you wanted to believe in the existence of color in a place like this. I watched for 5 minutes. Nothing moved. The footage was so still that I began to wonder if the feed had frozen. But then I noticed the timestamp in the corner, the seconds ticking forward with mechanical patience. I was about to look away when I saw it. Door 307, the one at the far end of the hallway, closest to the emergency exit. It was open. Not open like someone had left it ajar. Open like it had swung wide, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I hadn't seen it move. One frame it was closed, and the next it simply wasn't. As if the footage had skipped, or as if my eyes had betrayed me. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the screen. The darkness in that doorway seemed deeper than it should have been, denser somehow, like it was absorbing the light from the hallway, rather than simply existing in the absence of it. And then, at the very edge of the frame, something moved. It was a shadow. Just a shadow, sliding along the wall opposite the open door. It had no source that I could see, no figure casting it, no explanation for its presence. It moved with a kind of deliberate slowness, stretching and contracting as it traveled down the corridor toward the elevator. I watched it pass. Camera 8, then camera 7. Then it was gone, somewhere in the space between the last camera's view and the elevator itself. The elevator chimed. I turned so fast I knocked my book off the counter. The brass arrow was descending. 3, 2, 1. The doors opened. Empty. The car was empty. But as I stared into that yellowish light, I could have sworn I felt something staring back. Not saw. Felt. A pressure behind my eyes, a prickling at the base of my skull, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something that did not need eyes to see. The doors closed. The sensation faded, and I was left standing there, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the mind plays tricks at 3 a.m, that isolation and silence breed phantoms where none exist. I had read about this. Sleep deprivation causing hallucinations, the brain filling in patterns where there were none, the primitive part of the mind that still believed in monsters finding shapes in the darkness because that's what it was designed to do. I believed none of it. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button. The machinery groaned back to life, and I watched the arrow climb. 1, 2, 3. I stepped inside. The car smelled wrong. Not bad exactly. Not the rot or decay that horror movies had taught me to expect. It smelled old, like closed rooms and forgotten wardrobes, like air that had been sitting still for decades, undisturbed by breath or movement or anything that might remind it that time was still passing. I pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The ascent was slow, each floor marked by a subtle jolt that I felt in my knees. The fluorescent light above me hummed in a different pitch than the one at the reception desk, slightly higher, almost like a voice on the edge of forming words. I found myself holding my breath, listening for something I couldn't name. The doors opened. The 3rd floor hallway stretched before me, exactly as it had appeared on the camera. 12 doors, industrial carpet, walls that couldn't decide on a color. But standing there, in the flesh, I noticed things the camera hadn't shown me. The air was cold, not the pleasant cool of air conditioning, but the damp cold of basements and cellars. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you feel like you were trespassing somewhere you didn't belong. And it was quiet. Too quiet. In the lobby, there had been the hum of machinery, the distant sound of cars, the subtle presence of a world continuing to exist outside. Here, there was nothing. A silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if the floor itself was holding its breath. I took a step forward, then another. My footsteps should have echoed on the hard carpet, but they didn't. The sound was absorbed the moment it was made, swallowed by that impossible silence. Door 307 was closed now. I was certain it had been open on the camera, but here it stood, sealed like all the others, its brass numbers dull under the flickering hallway lights. I reached out and touched the handle. It was warm. Not hot. Warm. Body warm. The kind of warm that suggested someone had been holding it moments before. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, slow, measured, deliberate. But there was no one there. No shadow, no figure. Nothing but the endless stretch of doors and carpet and walls that seemed to be closing in around me. The footsteps stopped directly in front of me. I could feel the presence now, the same pressure I had felt at the elevator, that sensation of being seen by something I couldn't see. The air grew colder. My breath came out in small white clouds, and then, softly, so softly I might have imagined it, I heard a voice. It didn't speak words, not exactly. It was more like the memory of words, an impression of language that bypassed my ears and went directly to some deeper part of my brain. It asked a question I couldn't understand but somehow knew the shape of. "Why did you come?" I ran. I don't remember making the decision. One moment I was standing frozen in that hallway, and the next I was in the elevator, slamming the button for the lobby, watching the doors close with agonizing slowness while that presence pressed against the shrinking gap like a hand trying to reach through before it was too late. The doors sealed. The elevator descended. And when I stumbled back into the lobby, gasping for breath, the fluorescent light above the reception desk flickered twice and went still. I sat behind the counter for the rest of my shift, watching the elevator. The arrow never moved again. The cameras showed nothing but empty hallways, and when dawn finally crept through the tinted windows, painting the lobby in shades of gray and gold, I told myself it had been a dream. A waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and unfamiliarity. But when the day manager arrived at 6, I asked her about the third floor. I tried to sound casual, like I was making conversation rather than searching for answers. She looked at me strangely. There was something in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The look of someone who had been asked this question before. She told me the third floor had been closed for renovations 5 years ago. Budget cuts meant the work never got finished. No one was supposed to go up there. The elevator was programmed to skip it entirely. I didn't tell her about the arrow. I didn't tell her about the cameras or the footsteps, or the voice that wasn't quite a voice. I just nodded and collected my things and walked out into the morning light. But as I crossed the parking lot, I couldn't help glancing up at the building. At the third floor windows, a row of dark rectangles against the faded concrete. In one of them, I was almost certain, a curtain moved. I drove home with every light in my car turned on, the radio blaring, anything to fill the silence that had followed me from that hallway. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I told myself I would call the day manager and make up some excuse, some family emergency of my own. But lying in bed that afternoon, sleep refusing to come despite my exhaustion, I found myself thinking about that voice. That question I couldn't understand, but somehow recognized. Why did you come? And worse, the answer that kept echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind. Because you were waiting. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from the motel. A voicemail from the day manager, her voice clipped and professional. The regular night clerk wasn't coming back. Something about his mother. Something about a sudden decline. They needed someone to cover the shift again. Tonight. And every night after that. I stared at the ceiling, watching shadows crawl across the paint as the afternoon sun shifted through my blinds. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand. I already knew I was going to say yes. I already knew I had no choice. Because somewhere in that motel, on a floor that didn't exist in any official record, something was waiting. And it had been waiting for a very long time. And now, whether I wanted to admit it or not, it knew my face. Story 7. The forest has a way of swallowing sound. I learned this on my first solo hike through the Olympic Peninsula, when I stopped to catch my breath and realized I couldn't hear anything. Not birds, not wind, not even the creek I'd been following for the past hour. Just silence, thick and absolute, pressing against my eardrums like cotton soaked in something cold. That was 3 weeks ago. Before I found the cabin, before everything started to slip. I've been hiking these trails for 6 years now. The Pacific Northwest has become my cathedral, my therapy, my escape from the fluorescent purgatory of my office job in Seattle. Every weekend, I drive out to a different trailhead, lose myself in the green maze of Douglas firs and western red cedars, and return on Sunday evening feeling like I've shed a skin. The forest has always felt safe to me. Vast and indifferent, yes, but safe in its indifference. It didn't care about me, and there was comfort in that. The day I found the cabin, I had veered off the main trail to follow what looked like an old logging path. The October fog hung low between the trees, turning the world into something out of a dream. Soft edges, muted colors, the kind of light that makes you feel like you're walking through a photograph that's starting to fade. I'd been hiking for about 4 hours when the path opened into a small clearing, and there it was. A cabin, old, clearly abandoned, its wooden walls darkened to the color of wet bark. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine, and the single window facing me was clouded with decades of grime. Moss crept up the foundation stones, and ferns had colonized the narrow porch. It looked like the forest was slowly digesting it, pulling it back into the earth 1 inch at a time. I should have kept walking. I know that now. But curiosity has always been my weakness, that itch in the back of my skull that won't stop until I scratch it. I told myself I was just going to peek inside, maybe take a few photos for the hiking forum I frequented. Urban exploration light. Nothing dangerous. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully closed. It hung slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry and never bothered to pull it shut behind them. The hinges screamed when I pushed it open, a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in that small space. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and something else. Something almost sweet, like overripe fruit or flowers left too long in a vase. Dust motes drifted in the weak light that filtered through the dirty window, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost like they were spelling something I couldn't quite read. The cabin was a single room. A rusted iron bed frame occupied one corner, its mattress long since consumed by mice or time or both. A wooden table stood in the center, surrounded by 2 chairs that looked like they might collapse if you breathed on them too hard. Shelves lined one wall, cluttered with objects I couldn't immediately identify. Jars filled with murky liquid, bundles of dried herbs, what looked like animal bones arranged in careful rows. But it was the photograph that stopped me cold. It sat on the table, propped against an empty bottle, and even through the layer of dust that covered it, I could see the face clearly. A man, maybe 50 or 60, standing in front of this very cabin. He wore old-fashioned clothes, suspenders, a collarless shirt, heavy boots caked with mud. His expression was neutral, almost blank, but his eyes seemed to follow me as I moved closer. He looked like me. Not exactly like me. The shape of the jaw was slightly different, the hairline higher, but close enough that it could have been a photograph of my father, or my grandfather, or some distant ancestor I'd never known existed. The resemblance was unsettling in a way I couldn't articulate, like looking into a mirror that was reflecting something from a different angle, a different time. I picked up the photograph, wiped the dust away with my thumb. The man's eyes stared back at me, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something move in my peripheral vision. Something in the corner of the room, by the bed frame. I spun around, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing there, just shadows, just the cabin, holding its breath. I put the photograph back on the table and left. I didn't run exactly, but I walked faster than I needed to, and I didn't stop until I reached the main trail again. By the time I got back to my car, the fog had lifted and the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful, but somehow just looked like a warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, seeing the man's face every time I closed my eyes. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that faces repeat, that there are only so many ways a human face can be arranged, that I was projecting meaning onto randomness. But the explanation felt hollow, like a lie I was telling myself because the truth was too strange to accept. The next morning, I went back. I'm not sure why. Some part of me needed to see the cabin again, to prove to myself that it was real, that I hadn't imagined it. I brought my GPS this time, marked the coordinates on my phone, Even drew a rough map in my hiking journal. I was going to be scientific about it, rational. I was going to find the cabin, take proper photographs, maybe do some research into the history of the area. There had to be an explanation for the resemblance. An ancestor who'd settled in the region, perhaps. A branch of my family tree I didn't know about. I followed the same route I'd taken the day before, turned off at the same logging path, walked for the same amount of time. The fog was lighter today, and I could see further into the trees, which should have made me feel better but somehow didn't. Everything looked the same ferns, the same fallen logs, the same carpet of brown needles under my feet, but something felt different. The silence was deeper, more intentional, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The GPS showed I was at the exact coordinates where I'd marked the cabin. I checked twice, 3 times, turning in slow circles as I stared at the screen. The numbers didn't change. I was standing in the right place. But there was no cabin, just trees, ferns, the same endless green that surrounded me on all sides, unbroken and utterly ordinary. No clearing, no sagging roof, no moss-covered walls. Nothing to suggest that anyone had ever built anything here, ever lived here, ever existed here at all. I spent 2 hours searching. I walked in expanding circles, checked my GPS constantly, retraced my steps to make sure I hadn't made a wrong turn somewhere. Nothing. The cabin had vanished, or more accurately, it had never been there in the first place. Except I knew it had. I had touched the door, smelled the rot, held the photograph in my hands. I had felt the dust on my fingers, seen the way the light fell through that grimy window. It was real. It had to be real. I drove home in a daze, my mind churning with explanations that didn't explain anything. Maybe I'd marked the wrong coordinates. Maybe I'd been more disoriented than I thought. Maybe the fog had played tricks on my sense of direction. The rational part of my brain clung to these possibilities like a drowning man clinging to driftwood, but another part, a deeper, older part, knew they were lies. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. A week passed. I tried to forget about the cabin, to convince myself it had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Work was demanding, my sleep was erratic. It wasn't impossible that my mind had played a trick on me. I almost believed it. Then came the second hike. It was a different trail, 20 miles south of where I'd found the cabin, or hadn't found it, or whatever verb applied to a place that existed and didn't exist simultaneously. I'd chosen it specifically because it was far away, because I wanted to put distance between myself and whatever had happened. The day was clear and cold, the kind of late autumn weather that makes everything feel sharp and real, and for the first few hours, I felt almost normal, almost like myself again. I found the cabin at the bottom of a ravine. I wasn't even looking for it. I had stopped to drink some water and adjust my pack, and when I looked up, there it was, the same sagging roof, the same darkened wood, the same moss creeping up the foundation stones. It was impossible. It was 20 miles from where it should have been, in terrain that looked nothing like the clearing I'd found before. But it was the same cabin. I knew it the way you know your own face in a mirror, without thinking, without doubt. My legs carried me toward it before my brain could object. The porch steps creaked under my weight, the same creak, I was sure of it, and the door hung slightly ajar, just as it had before. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped inside, rot and sweetness, decay and something almost alive underneath it all. The photograph was on the table. I walked toward it slowly, each step feeling like I was moving through water, through honey, through something thick and resistant that didn't want to let me go. My hand shook as I reached for it, lifted it, turned it toward the light. The man was still there. The same face, the same blank expression, the same eyes that seemed to follow me. But he wasn't wearing the old-fashioned clothes anymore. He was wearing my jacket. The green Gore-Tex jacket I'd been wearing the day I first found the cabin. And he was standing in front of this same cabin, in this same pose, but the background was different. The trees were arranged differently. The light was coming from a different angle. Like the photograph had been taken yesterday. Like he had been waiting for me to come back so he could show me what he'd become. What I'd become. I dropped the photograph. It hit the floor with a sound that was too loud, too final, and I stumbled backward until my shoulders hit the wall. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. Photographs don't change. Cabins don't move. Men who've been dead for a century don't update their wardrobes. And yet, I forced myself to pick up the photograph again, forced myself to look at it, really look at it, to find some detail that would prove I was wrong, that this was a different picture, a different man, a different cabin. But there was nothing. Just my face. Not quite my face, but close enough, staring back at me from a moment that hadn't happened yet, or had always been happening, or was happening right now in some layer of time I couldn't see. The light in the cabin was changing. I hadn't noticed it at first, but the shadows were longer than they should have been, darker, more solid. The corners of the room seemed to be pulling away from me, stretching into distances that didn't match the cabin's small dimensions. And there was a sound now, not silence anymore, but something worse. A low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere beneath the floor. I ran. I don't remember leaving the cabin, don't remember climbing out of the ravine or finding the trail again. I just remember running, branches whipping my face, my lungs burning, my legs pumping with a terror that felt older than I was, more primal, something inherited from ancestors who had learned to fear the dark things that lived in forests like this one. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting again. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, shaking, trying to make my hands steady enough to turn the key. When I finally looked in the rearview mirror, I saw my own face, pale, wild-eyed, smeared with dirt and sweat. And for one horrible moment, I wasn't sure if it was me or him looking back. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't been hiking since. I've barely left my apartment. I spend my days at work, going through the motions, and my nights lying awake, listening for sounds that aren't there. Sometimes I think I hear it, that heartbeat pulse, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere in the walls or under the floor or inside my own head. I don't know anymore. I can't tell the difference. The photograph is in my dresser drawer. I took it with me when I ran. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe, or the irrational hope that having it would somehow give me control over whatever was happening. I've looked at it a dozen times since then, and every time the man is wearing something different. My blue sweater, my gray hoodie, the shirt I wore to my sister's birthday party last year. Always my clothes, always my cabin, always those eyes that are mine and not mine, watching me from across a distance I can't measure. I've started to wonder if I'm the one who's changing. If every time I look at the photograph I become a little more like him, or he becomes a little more like me, until eventually there's no difference at all. Until I walk into the forest one day and never come out, and some hiker years from now finds a cabin that wasn't there before, finds a photograph of a man who looks just like him, and the whole thing starts again. Last night, I dreamed I was standing in the cabin, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged there, who had always belonged there. The photograph was in my hands, but when I looked at it, the frame was empty. Just a blank square of faded paper where a face should have been. And when I looked up at the window, I saw a man standing outside, peering in through the dirty glass. He was wearing my jacket. I woke up with the taste of rot in my mouth and the certainty that something had changed while I was sleeping. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked to the dresser, opened the drawer, and pulled out the photograph with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. The man was gone. The cabin was still there, the trees, the moss-covered stones. But where he had been standing, there was only empty space, a gap in the image where a person used to be. I looked at my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. I was still there, still me. But my eyes looked different, older, blanker, like they were waiting for something. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if the cabin will find me again, or if I'll find it, or if the distinction even matters anymore. All I know is that the forest is patient. It has been waiting for a long time, and it knows how to swallow things, sounds, paths, people, without leaving a trace. Sometimes I think I can feel it watching me, even here, even in my apartment in the middle of the city. Sometimes I think I can hear that heartbeat pulse in the silence between traffic sounds, in the spaces between my own thoughts. And sometimes, late at night, when the city goes quiet and the darkness presses against my window like something trying to get in, I think I understand what the photograph has been trying to tell me all along. I'm not becoming him. I already was. Story 8. The first thing I noticed about the mansion wasn't its size or its age or the way ivy had consumed the eastern wall like a slow green fire. It was the silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the wet click of your throat when you swallow. The kind of silence that feels inhabited. The owner met me at the wrought iron gate on a Tuesday morning in late October. He was older than I'd expected, somewhere past 70, with the papery skin and deliberate movements of a man who had learned to conserve his energy. His handshake was dry and brief, and he spoke in clipped sentences that seemed designed to end conversations rather than sustain them. "You come highly recommended," he said, leading me up the gravel path. "I need discretion, craftsmanship, someone who won't ask unnecessary questions." I told him I was all three. The mansion itself was a Victorian nightmare. 3 stories of dark brick and gabled windows, wraparound porches that sagged in places, chimneys that had crumbled into decorative stumps. Inside, the air smelled of dust and something else, something organic and faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips. The floorboards groaned with every step, and I could hear things scuttling in the walls. Mice, probably, or squirrels. The kind of wildlife that claims abandoned spaces. He walked me through the ground floor, pointing out water damage, structural concerns, sections where the plaster had given way entirely. I took notes on my tablet, photographed problem areas, asked about permits and timelines and budgets. He answered everything with that same clipped efficiency, never offering more information than strictly necessary. Then we reached the hallway on the second floor. It was narrower than the others, lit by a single window at the far end that let in a rectangle of gray light. The walls here were different, darker, paneled in some wood I didn't recognize. And at the end of the hallway there was a door. Heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, the kind of door you'd expect to find on a vault or a prison cell. It had no handle, only a keyhole the size of my thumbnail. "This room," he said, and for the first time his voice changed. Something entered it. Not quite fear, not quite reverence, but something adjacent to both. "This room is not part of the renovation. You are not to enter it. You are not to open this door. You are not to touch this door. Do you understand?" I understood. Or at least, I thought I did. Rich people have their eccentricities. Maybe it was a family shrine, or a collection of something valuable, or something illegal. I'd learned long ago not to pry into the private lives of clients who paid well and on time. Whatever was behind that door was none of my business. "Of course," I said. "I'll stay away." He held my gaze for a long moment, searching for something in my face. Then he nodded, once, and led me back downstairs. For the first 3 weeks, I kept my word. The work was demanding, stripping walls, reinforcing beams, replacing sections of the roof that had rotted through. I hired a small crew, 3 men I'd worked with before, and we established a rhythm. In by 7, out by 5, lunch on the back porch where we could see the overgrown garden and the stone wall that marked the property's edge. The owner was rarely present. He lived in the guest house behind the main building, and I'd sometimes see his silhouette in the window at night, standing motionless, watching the mansion as if waiting for something. But I thought about the room. I thought about it while I was measuring crown molding and patching cracks in the ceiling. I thought about it while I was eating lunch, while I was driving home, while I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. The door appeared in my dreams, heavy and dark and somehow breathing, the keyhole like a pupil dilating in the shadows. I'd wake with the sensation of being watched, that prickling awareness along the back of my neck, and I'd lie there in the darkness listening to the ordinary sounds of my apartment and trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Just a room, just a door, just a strange old man with strange old money and strange old secrets. On the 23rd day, the crew found a problem with the electrical system in the second-floor hallway. The wiring was ancient, cloth-wrapped copper that had been chewed through in places, a fire waiting to happen. I sent them home early and stayed behind to assess the damage, to trace the wires back to their source. The trail led me to the end of the hallway, to the door. I stood there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. The gray light from the window had faded to a dim purple. Shadows gathered in the corners, thickening like something alive. And from behind the door, I heard, or thought I heard, a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass. I told myself it was pipes, or wind, or an animal trapped in the walls. I told myself a lot of things in the days that followed, and none of them were true. That night, I found the key. It was in a drawer in the study, hidden beneath a stack of yellowed papers, birth certificates, property deeds, documents in languages I didn't recognize. A small iron key, corroded with age, but unmistakably the right size for that keyhole. I don't remember deciding to take it. I only remember the weight of it in my palm, the way it seemed to pulse with a faint warmth, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. The room was lined with mirrors, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, mirrors that reflected mirrors that reflected mirrors, an infinite regression of surfaces that seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight and scatter it into 1,000 fractured stars. The air inside was cold, unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with absence, an absence of warmth, an absence of life, an absence of something I couldn't name. I stood in the center of the room and watched myself multiply into eternity. Hundreds of me, thousands of me, stretching backward into an infinite corridor of glass and shadow. My reflection did exactly what I did, raised its hand when I raised mine, turned its head when I turned mine, breathed when I breathed. Then I found the light switch. The fluorescent tubes buzzed to life overhead, flooding the room with harsh white light. And in that moment, I saw what the mirrors really showed. It was me. Unmistakably, irrefutably me. The same face, the same build, the same clothes I was wearing. But wrong. The reflection shirt was torn at the shoulder, exposing skin that was mottled with bruises I didn't have. There was a cut along its jawline, partially healed, scabbed over with dried blood. Its left eye was swollen, the skin around it a deep purple black, and the way it stood, hunched, protective, as if anticipating a blow that hadn't yet fallen, was nothing like the way I stood. I touched my face. The reflection touched its face. The movements were synchronized, perfect, but the images didn't match. I turned off the lights, turned them back on. The reflection remained the same, battered, wounded, watching me with eyes that seemed to hold a knowledge I didn't possess. A warning, or maybe a promise. I fled the room. I locked the door behind me. I drove home at twice the speed limit, my hands shaking on the wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And I told myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress, by lack of sleep, by the oppressive atmosphere of that decaying mansion. I told myself I wouldn't go back. But I did go back. The next morning, I went back, because I had a job to finish and a reputation to maintain. And when I arrived, I found the first mark, a bruise on my left forearm, small, circular, the size of a fingerprint. I didn't remember how I'd gotten it. I didn't remember bumping into anything, catching myself on any sharp edges. But there it was, purple-blue against my skin, exactly where the reflection had shown a similar mark. Coincidence, I told myself. I'm a contractor. I get bruises all the time. 2 days later, I woke up with a cut on my palm, a thin red line across the meat of my thumb, shallow but unmistakable. I checked the mirrors in my bathroom. Normal reflections, nothing unusual. But I couldn't shake the memory of that other reflection, the one in the room that watched, and the wound I'd seen on its hand. The crew began to notice changes. They asked if I was sleeping enough, eating enough, if something was wrong at home. I deflected their questions with vague answers and forced smiles. But I could see the way they looked at me when they thought I wasn't watching. The concern, the confusion, the slowly dawning suspicion that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I started avoiding mirrors. I covered the one in my bathroom with a towel. I walked past store windows with my eyes fixed straight ahead. But I couldn't escape my own reflection. It was everywhere. In the chrome of my tools, in the dark screens of my phone and tablet, in pools of water and polished surfaces. And every time I caught a glimpse of myself, I'd freeze, searching for discrepancies, for wounds that didn't belong, for the face of the battered stranger who was slowly becoming me. A week after I first entered the room, I returned. I needed to understand. I needed to know if the reflection had changed, if the wounds had progressed, if whatever was happening to me was accelerating or stabilizing or, God help me, reversing. I waited until the crew had gone, until the owner's silhouette had retreated from the guest house window, until the mansion settled into that deep and suffocating silence I'd come to dread. The door opened easily. The room was exactly as I'd left it. Mirrors upon mirrors, cold air, the faint smell of something I couldn't identify. I found the light switch. The reflection that stared back at me was worse. The bruises had multiplied, spread, deepened into angry shades of purple and black. The cut on its jaw had reopened, trailing a thin line of blood down its neck. One of its arms hung at an odd angle, as if the shoulder had been dislocated. And its eyes were the worst part. They held a desperation I recognized, a terror I was beginning to feel myself, and something else. Something like resignation, something like surrender. I spoke to it. I asked it what it wanted, what was happening, what I needed to do to make it stop. My voice echoed off the mirrors, fractured and multiplied until it sounded like a chorus of desperate men all asking the same question. The reflection didn't answer. It only watched. And when I finally turned away, when I finally forced myself to leave that room and lock the door behind me, I felt something shift in the air around me. A presence. A weight. The unmistakable sensation of being observed by something that had no eyes. I write this from my apartment, 3 weeks after that second visit. The wounds have continued to appear, a gash on my shin that appeared overnight, bruises along my ribs that make it painful to breathe, a swelling around my left eye that no amount of ice can reduce. My crew quit last week, all 3 of them, on the same day, without explanation. The owner has stopped returning my calls. I've seen doctors. I've had tests run. There's no medical explanation for what's happening to my body. No underlying condition, no blood disorder, no trauma that I can't remember. The injuries simply appear, manifesting out of nothing, as if my flesh is being reshaped by something I can't see or understand. I've stopped looking at mirrors entirely. I've covered every reflective surface in my apartment with sheets and blankets and pieces of cardboard, but I can still feel them watching me. Every pane of glass, every polished surface, every dark window at night, they're all doors now, all passages to that other place, that other version of me who is slowly becoming my only truth. Yesterday, I found a photograph of myself from a month ago. I was smiling. My skin was clear. My eyes were bright. I looked like a stranger. Tonight, I will return to the room. I don't know what I expect to find. Perhaps the reflection will be whole again, healed, and whatever connection exists between us will have been severed. Perhaps it will be worse, broken beyond recognition, a prophecy of horrors yet to come. Perhaps the mirrors will show me something else entirely, some truth about the nature of reality that I am not prepared to accept. Or perhaps I will find nothing, an empty room, ordinary glass reflecting an ordinary man. And I will be left to wonder if any of this was ever real, if the wounds on my body are wounds at all. or simply the physical manifestation of a mind that has finally, irrevocably, shattered. The key is in my pocket. The sun has set. The mansion waits in its valley of shadows, patient and hungry, its windows dark, and its silence absolute. I am going back. And whatever I find in that room, whatever truth or lie or impossible horror awaits me in the infinite corridors of my own reflection, I know one thing with absolute certainty. The room has always been watching, and now, at last, I am ready to watch back. What I cannot know, what I may never know, is which version of me will be standing when the lights come on, the one in the mirror, with his wounds and his warnings and his terrible knowledge, or the one I have always believed myself to be, whole and sane and certain of the ground beneath his feet. Perhaps there is no difference. Perhaps there never was. Story 9. The smell reached me first. Something between burnt copper and wet stone, a scent that seemed to coat the inside of my throat before I could even process what I was breathing. It drifted down from the third floor like an uninvited guest, settling into the hallways of my building with the persistence of a stain that refuses to fade. I've owned this building for 11 years. 4 floors, 16 apartments, mostly graduate students and young professionals who keep to themselves and pay their rent on time. I know every creak of these stairs, every temperamental radiator, every draft that sneaks through the windows when November winds blow off the lake. This building and I have an understanding, or at least we did. The man arrived in August. He came to my office on a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in every way that should have made him forgettable. Medium height, medium build, brown hair that might have been gray at the temples, or might have been a trick of the light. His face was the kind you'd struggle to describe to a police sketch artist. Features that seemed to shift slightly whenever I looked away, as if my memory couldn't quite hold on to them. He wore a dark coat despite the heat, buttoned to the throat. He wanted apartment 3C, specifically 3C. When I mentioned that 3B was also available, larger, better light, same price, he simply repeated his request as if I hadn't spoken. His voice carried a faint accent I couldn't place, something that elongated certain vowels and clipped others short. Eastern European, perhaps, or something older. Then he did something no tenant has ever done in my 11 years as a landlord. He paid the full year's rent in advance. Cash. Crisp bills that smelled faintly of that same burnt copper scent, though I dismissed it at the time as my imagination working overtime. He asked for no receipt, no lease explanation, nothing. Just the keys and a single request, delivered with the weight of a command. Do not disturb me, for any reason. I should have found this strange. I did find it strange. But the money was real, and the building needed a new boiler. And sometimes we make bargains with the inexplicable because the alternative, asking too many questions, feels somehow dangerous. The complaints began 3 weeks later. The couple in 3A came to me first, their faces pinched with the particular exhaustion of people who haven't slept properly in days. They described sounds coming through their shared wall with 3C, not loud exactly, but persistent. A rhythmic scraping, like furniture being dragged across the floor in endless circles. Murmuring voices that rose and fell in patterns that almost resembled speech, but never quite resolved into recognizable words. The wife mentioned that she'd pressed her ear to the wall once, trying to make sense of it, and had pulled away with the sudden, inexplicable certainty that something on the other side had pressed back. I promised to look into it. I didn't. A week later, the graduate student in 3D stopped me in the lobby. He was studying linguistics, he explained, and the language he heard through his ceiling, 3C was directly below him, matched nothing in any family he'd ever encountered. He'd recorded snippets on his phone, played them for his advisor, who'd suggested they might be some obscure dialect or perhaps a constructed language for a game or film. But there was something about the cadence, the student said, something that felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. The sounds followed rules. He was certain of that. Grammar, syntax, but rules that seemed designed for a throat shaped differently than a human's. I promised to look into it. Again, I didn't. Then came the smell. It seeped into the third-floor hallway like fog rolling in from a poisoned sea. The burnt copper intensified, joined now by something organic, something that reminded me of the mushrooms that grew in my grandmother's root cellar. That damp, underground darkness made olfactory. The elderly woman in 3B, who had lived in the building longer than I'd owned it, told me through her barely cracked door that she'd started sleeping with a towel pressed against the gap beneath her entrance. She didn't look at me when she spoke. She looked past me, toward 3C, and I noticed her hands trembling against the door frame. "Something's wrong in there," she whispered. "Something's growing." That night, I stood outside apartment 3C for the first time since handing over the keys. The door looked the same as every other door in the building, wooden, painted the same institutional beige, numbered with the same brass fixtures. But the air around it felt different, thicker. The smell was strongest here, of course, almost visible, almost textured. I raised my hand to knock, then stopped. Through the door, I heard footsteps. Not the ordinary footsteps of a man moving through his home. These were synchronized, rhythmic, like a march, but with too many feet. They moved in patterns across the floor, back and forth, and beneath them, that murmuring voice continued its alien liturgy. I went back to my apartment and didn't sleep. The following weeks carved themselves into my consciousness like water wearing grooves into stone. I became hyper-aware of the third floor, attuned to it in ways that felt unhealthy, obsessive. I'd find myself pausing on the stairs, listening. I'd wake at 3 in the morning, certain I'd heard that rhythmic scraping directly above my bedroom. Impossible since my apartment was on the first floor. The smell began appearing in places it shouldn't. My car, my office downtown, the grocery store 3 blocks away. I'd catch whiffs of it and spin around, expecting to see that forgettable face with its sliding features. But there was never anyone there. The other tenants stopped complaining. This should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like surrender. I began watching the building's entrance obsessively, noting every person who came and went. I never saw the man from 3C leave. Not once. No deliveries arrived for him. No mail accumulated in his box. It was as if he'd checked into my building and simply ceased to exist as a physical being who required food, sunlight, human contact. My wife noticed the change in me before I did. She said I'd become distant, distracted. She said I muttered in my sleep now. Fragments of something that sounded like words but weren't. She said I'd started scratching at my arms without realizing it, leaving red tracks across my skin like I was trying to dig something out. I told her about the tenant, about the sounds and the smell and my growing conviction that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong in apartment 3C. She listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a loved one's irrationality. "Then check on him," she said finally. "You're the landlord. You have every right." She was correct, of course. I had a spare key. I had legal justification. The complaints, the smell, the potential health hazard. I had every rational reason to open that door and confirm that my fears were baseless, that the man in 3C was simply eccentric, that the sounds were a television, and the smell was incense, and the footsteps were exercise routines performed at odd hours. But I didn't go. Not yet. Because some part of me, the part that still remembered my grandmother's warnings about doors that shouldn't be opened and thresholds that shouldn't be crossed, understood that some confirmations come at a cost too high to pay. I finally entered on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The building was quiet. The other third-floor tenants were at work or class or wherever people went when they weren't trapped in the orbit of something they couldn't name. I stood outside 3C with the spare key sweating in my palm, listening. Silence. No scraping. No murmuring. No synchronized footsteps. For the first time in weeks, apartment 3C was completely, utterly still. I knocked first. 3 sharp raps that echoed down the empty hallway. Nothing. I called out, identifying myself, explaining that I was conducting a routine inspection. Nothing. I pressed my ear to the door the way the woman in 3A had pressed hers to the wall, and I felt nothing pressing back. The key turned smoothly. The door swung inward without resistance. The apartment was empty. Not empty the way a vacant unit is empty, with the bones of domesticity still visible, curtain rods, outlet covers, the ghost marks of furniture on carpet. This was a deeper emptiness, an emptiness that felt deliberate, curated. The walls were bare, the windows were bare. The carpet was gone, revealing hardwood floors I didn't remember being there, dark wood that seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light rather than reflect it. And covering those floors, edge to edge, corner to corner, were footprints. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, pressed into a thin layer of something gray and powdery, ash, perhaps, or dust, or something I didn't have a name for. They overlapped and intersected, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, patterns that suggested movement but not human movement, navigation but not through any space that followed normal geometries. I stepped inside. The smell was gone, completely, impossibly gone, as if it had never existed. The air was cold and still and tasted faintly of metal, and as I moved further into the apartment, I noticed that the footprints weren't random. They formed paths, roots. They wound through the empty space in spirals and angles, clustering in certain areas, avoiding others entirely. And at the center of the living room, where the paths converged, was a single clear space, a circle perhaps 3 feet in diameter where no footprints touched, where the dark wood gleamed bare and untouched. I stood at the edge of that circle for a long time. I don't know how long. The light through the windows shifted from gray to gold to gray again, and I didn't move, because I understood with a terrible clarity that stepping into that empty space would mean something, would change something, would complete some equation whose variables I couldn't begin to comprehend. The footprints were fresh. I could see that now. Still slightly damp, still holding their shapes with the precision of recent making. Whatever had walked these patterns, whatever was still walking them perhaps in some place adjacent to this one, had been here moments before I arrived, had known I was coming, had left me this. I don't remember leaving the apartment. I remember standing in my own living room, my wife's hands on my face, her voice asking me where I'd been, why I was shaking, why I wasn't answering her. I remember looking at my feet and seeing gray powder dusting my shoes, powder that I tracked across our carpet in footprints of my own, footprints that seemed to follow the same impossible angles as the ones in 3C. I burned those shoes. The apartment stays empty now. No one will rent it. The few people I've shown it to, prospective tenants who don't know its history, all report the same unease, the same inexplicable reluctance to cross the threshold. One young woman made it 3 steps inside before turning and walking out without a word, her face pale, her hands pressed over her mouth. The footprints are gone. I checked. The day after I first entered, I went back with a camera and a flashlight, and the grim determination of a man facing his fear. The floors were bare, clean. No powder, no patterns, no evidence that anything had ever been there except ordinary hardwood and ordinary dust. But sometimes, late at night, I hear them. The footsteps, coming from the apartment directly above mine. There is no apartment directly above mine. I've started documenting everything, recording the sounds when I can catch them, photographing my arms, which bear scratches now that I don't remember making. Scratches that form patterns, angles, routes. My wife has moved to her sister's temporarily. She says I need help. She says I've become obsessed with something that was never there, that the tenant was just a strange man with strange habits who left without saying goodbye, that the footprints were a trick of light and dust and my own desperate need to find meaning in the mundane. Maybe she's right. Maybe the man who paid in cash and asked not to be disturbed was exactly what he appeared to be. Forgettable, unremarkable, gone. But I keep thinking about what the linguistics student said, about languages that follow rules designed for throats shaped differently than a human's. I keep thinking about the woman in 3B and her certainty that something was growing. I keep thinking about that empty circle in the center of all those footprints, that clear space that felt like an invitation or a warning or both. And I keep thinking about the pattern I found this morning, traced in the gray dust that had somehow accumulated on my bedroom floor overnight. It wasn't footprints this time. It was writing. A single line in characters I couldn't read, symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves whenever I looked away, grammar and syntax for something that wasn't meant to be seen by human eyes. I photographed it before I swept it away. I've stared at that photograph for hours, trying to decipher its message, its meaning, its purpose. Sometimes I almost understand it. Sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleep, when my mind is soft and permeable and open to things it would normally reject, I hear that murmuring voice from apartment 3C, and I realize it's my own voice. Speaking words I don't remember learning, following routes I can't see, walking patterns that were laid out for me long before I ever turned that key. The building is quiet now. The third floor has emptied. Tenants breaking leases, moving without explanation, leaving behind security deposits they never returned to claim. I don't blame them. I've felt it too. That pressure that builds behind the eyes when you spend too long in the hallways. That sense of being watched from angles that shouldn't exist. I should sell the building. I should walk away. I should do any of the sensible things that a sensible man would do when faced with something he cannot explain, cannot control, cannot even properly perceive. But I don't. Because the footprints are coming back. I see them sometimes, in my peripheral vision. Gray traces on the lobby floor, on the stairs, on the sidewalk outside. They appear and vanish like frost, like breath, like memories of something that hasn't happened yet. They form paths, routes. They lead somewhere I haven't found, somewhere I'm not sure I want to find, somewhere I'm increasingly certain I will find anyway, whether I choose to or not. Last night, I dreamed I was standing in apartment 3C again. The footprints were fresh beneath my feet. The circle at the center was waiting, and from somewhere far away, or somewhere very, very close, I heard a voice speaking words I almost understood. It was thanking me for keeping the door open, for keeping the path clear, for being exactly where I was supposed to be at exactly the right time, doing exactly what I was always going to do. I woke with gray dust on my pillow and the taste of burnt copper in my mouth. And I woke with the certainty, the absolute unshakable certainty, that something was standing in the corner of my room, watching me with eyes I couldn't see, waiting for me to understand, waiting for me to step into the circle, waiting for me to complete the pattern. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake now, staring at shadows that might be shadows and might be something else entirely, is that I'm starting to want to. Story 10. Like the bar across the street doesn't exist during the day. I know this because I've walked past it 17 times in the last 3 weeks, and every single time, the building sits there like a corpse. Windows shattered, the old neon sign hanging by a single rusted chain, the door boarded up with plywood so warped by rain and neglect that it bows outward like a swollen belly. The place has been dead for years, maybe decades. The kind of forgotten ruin that cities accumulate in their forgotten corners, ignored by everyone who passes by. But after midnight, everything changes. I work from home. Software development, the kind of job that keeps you chained to a desk for 12 hours at a stretch, your eyes burning from the glow of multiple monitors, your back twisted into shapes that will haunt you in your 40s. The insomnia started about 2 months ago. Not the gentle kind where you lie in bed and eventually drift off, but the cruel variety that jolts you awake at 2 a.m., with your heart pounding and your sheets soaked through with sweat you don't remember producing. The doctors say it's stress. The therapist says it's anxiety. I say it's something else entirely, something I can't name, something that started the first night I looked out my window and saw the lights. My apartment sits on the 3rd floor of a brownstone that's seen better centuries. The window in my bedroom faces the street, and beyond the street, the bar. That first night, I woke gasping from a dream I couldn't remember, and when I pulled back the curtain to ground myself in something real, I saw them. Warm amber lights glowing behind the shattered windows, the soft pulse of movement inside, shadows passing back and forth like dancers at a party I hadn't been invited to. I told myself it was a trick of the streetlights, a reflection from somewhere else, bounced and distorted by the broken glass. I went back to bed and didn't sleep until dawn painted the sky gray. The second night, I heard the music. It was faint, barely a whisper carried on the humid summer air. Something old, something with horns and piano, the kind of jazz they played in speakeasies when my great-grandparents were young. I pressed my face against the window screen and strained to hear more, but the melody kept slipping away, always just at the edge of perception, like trying to remember a word that's on the tip of your tongue. By the third week, I had developed a ritual. I would wake, always between 1 and 3 a.m., never by choice, and I would go to the window. I would watch the bar come alive. I would count the silhouettes that passed behind the grimy glass. I would try to make out faces, features, anything that might tell me who these people were and why they gathered in a building that shouldn't be able to hold anyone. The silhouettes never resolved into anything clear. They remained suggestions of human forms, outlines without substance, moving with a fluidity that seemed almost liquid. Sometimes they appeared to be dancing. Sometimes they simply stood, facing the windows, facing me, as if they knew I was watching. I started keeping a notebook. Times, observations, anything that might help me understand what I was seeing. The lights always appeared between 12:47 and 1:15 a.m. They always went dark by 4:30, sometimes earlier. The music, when I could hear it, followed no pattern I could discern. Some nights it was lively, almost celebratory. Other nights it was slow and mournful, the kind of sound that makes you think of empty chairs at dinner tables, of phone calls that never come. Last Tuesday, I finally decided to cross the street. I had been watching for 43 minutes. The bar was particularly active that night, more shadows than I had ever counted before, all of them moving in what looked like some kind of coordinated pattern. A dance, perhaps. A ritual. The music was louder too, loud enough that I could almost make out individual instruments, a trumpet, a standing bass, the delicate tinkle of a piano playing something in a minor key. I put on my shoes. I didn't bother changing out of my pajamas. The street was empty at that hour, the kind of empty that cities achieve only in those liminal hours between very late and very early, when even the insomniacs have given up and the early risers haven't yet begun. My footsteps echoed off the pavement as I crossed, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the air itself was thickening around me, pushing back. I stopped on the sidewalk in front of the bar. The silence hit me like a physical force. From my window, I had heard music. I had seen lights, movement, life. But standing there, close enough to touch the crumbling brick facade, there was nothing. The windows were dark. The building was silent. The plywood over the door hung exactly as it always had, undisturbed, thick with dust and the accumulated grime of years of abandonment. I turned around, and there, reflected in the window of the building behind me, a laundromat, closed for the night, its plate glass window dark and mirror-like in the streetlight. I saw the bar as I had seen it from my bedroom. Lights blazing, shadows moving, and in the doorway, standing just inside the threshold, a figure that seemed to be looking directly at me. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, door locked, deadbolt thrown, chain secured. I stood with my back against the wall, breathing hard, trying to convince myself that what I had seen was impossible. A reflection of a reflection, maybe. Some trick of light and angle and my own sleep-deprived brain, desperate to make patterns out of random noise. But I couldn't stop thinking about that figure in the doorway, the way it had stood so still while everything else moved around it, the way it seemed to be waiting. The next night I tried again. This time I brought my phone. I filmed the bar from my window first, capturing the lights, the movement, the ghostly suggestion of music that my microphone barely registered as a faint hiss. Then I crossed the street, keeping my camera running, narrating my observations in a whisper that felt too loud in the empty night. The same thing happened. As I approached, the bar went dark. As I turned around, the reflection showed me everything I couldn't see directly. The lights, the shadows, the figure in the doorway, closer now, standing on what should have been the threshold between inside and out. I watched myself watching it. In the reflection, I could see my own back, my phone raised, the glow of my screen a pale blue ghost in the darkness. And behind me, or rather, in front of me, in the reflection, the figure raised one hand in what might have been a wave, or a beckoning, or a warning. I didn't run this time. I stood there, frozen, watching the reflected scene play out like a movie projected onto glass. The figure stepped forward, crossing the threshold, moving out onto the reflected sidewalk. It moved wrong, I realized. Not like a person walks, with the thousand small adjustments of balance and momentum, but smoothly, gliding, as if it were being pushed across a stage on hidden wheels. When I finally found the strength to move, I turned around slowly, keeping my phone up, still recording. The bar behind me was dark and dead and empty, just as it had always been, just as it would always be, in the direct light of reality. But in the reflection, the figure stood less than 10 feet away. I've been inside my apartment for 4 days now. I've called in sick to work. I've had groceries delivered, leaving them outside my door until I'm sure the delivery person has gone. I've taped newspaper over my bedroom window because I can't stop myself from looking, and every time I look, I see more than I should. The reflections are spreading. It started with the window, but now I see them everywhere. In the bathroom mirror, where the lights of the bar glow behind my own face like a halo of amber fire. In the dark screen of my laptop when it goes to sleep, where the shadows dance in miniature, performing for an audience of one. In the black glass of my phone, in the surface of my coffee when the light hits it just right, in the polished chrome of my kitchen faucet. The figure is always there, watching, waiting, closer every time, though I've stopped crossing the street, stopped leaving my apartment at all. It doesn't seem to matter. Distance means nothing to reflections. I've started to notice things about it. Details that emerge slowly, like photographs developing in a darkroom. It wears something dark, a suit or a coat, the kind of formal attire that no one bothers with anymore. Its face remains indistinct, but there's a suggestion of features. The hollow where eyes should be, the dark slash of a mouth that might be smiling or might be something else entirely. Its hands are long, fingers that seem to have too many joints, and they're always moving, always gesturing, as if it's trying to tell me something in a language I don't speak. 3 nights ago, I heard knocking, not at my door. I checked, heart hammering, peering through the peephole at an empty hallway. The knocking came from inside my apartment, from the bathroom mirror, from the window, even through the newspaper I'd taped over it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, patient and persistent, like someone waiting to be let in. I didn't answer. I sat in the middle of my living room, in the one spot I'd found where no reflective surface could catch my image, and I waited for dawn. The knocking stopped around 4:30, just when the bar's lights always went dark. I've been researching. Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations. I know this. The brain, deprived of REM sleep, starts to dream while awake, projecting its internal movies onto the external world. Everything I'm seeing could be explained by my own misfiring neurons, my exhausted mind creating patterns and presences where none exist. But that doesn't explain the photos. I went through the footage I recorded that night on the sidewalk. Most of it is dark, blurry, the kind of shaky amateur video that reveals nothing. But there's one frame, just one, lasting less than a second, where the reflection in the laundromat window shows something my eyes shouldn't have been able to see. The bar, the lights, the figure, and next to the figure, barely visible in the amber glow, another shape. Smaller, dimmer, but unmistakably present. It looked like me. I've stopped sleeping entirely. Coffee, energy drinks, whatever it takes to keep my eyes open. Because I've realized something that makes my blood run cold. The figure gets closer when I sleep. Every time I drift off, even for a few minutes, I wake to find the reflections have changed. The figure has moved. It's crossed some invisible threshold, broken some unspoken rule. Last night I saw it in the reflection of my cereal bowl. It was standing in my kitchen. I don't know what happens when it finally reaches me. I don't know if this is real, or if I've finally broken down completely, my mind splintering under the weight of weeks without proper rest. Part of me wants to believe it's just psychosis, just my brain playing tricks, because that would mean there's a cure, a pill I could take, a therapy that could bring me back to the world everyone else lives in. But part of me knows better. The bar exists. I'm certain of that now. It exists in the space between seeing and being seen, in the gap between the world and its reflection. And something lives there, something that has noticed me watching, something that has decided, for reasons I can't begin to understand, that I should join it. Tonight, I'm going to cross the street one more time. I've covered every reflective surface in my apartment, but I can still feel the figure watching. I can still hear the music, fainter now, as if it's moving away from me, or as if I'm meant to follow. The bar's lights will come on in a few hours, and I'll be there, standing on the sidewalk, facing the door that isn't really a door. I've decided I won't turn around this time. I won't look for the reflection. I'll walk forward, through the plywood, through the brick, through whatever barrier separates this world from the one that exists only in glass and shadow. Maybe I'll find answers. Maybe I'll find out what the figure wants, why it chose me, what I saw all those nights from my window. Or maybe I'll become another shadow, another silhouette passing behind broken windows, another presence that exists only when someone else is watching. If you're reading this, and you live in a city, and you've ever noticed a building that seems dead during the day but alive after midnight, don't watch, don't look. And whatever you do, don't cross the street. Because once you see the bar sees you. And what exists in reflections has a way of becoming real. Story 11. The garage door was already open when I pulled into my new driveway for the first time. I remember this detail with absolute clarity because it was the first thing I noticed about the house across the street. Not the beige siding identical to every other home on the block, not the lawn trimmed to regulation height, not the mailbox standing at the exact same angle as mine. No. What caught my attention was that garage door, raised perhaps 2 feet from the ground, creating a horizontal slice of darkness that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. And somewhere within that darkness, I could swear I saw movement, a shape, the suggestion of someone sitting very, very still. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, the exhaustion of a cross-country move settling into my bones. I had driven 14 hours that day, surviving on gas station coffee, and the kind of determination that only comes from running away from something you refuse to name. This suburb was supposed to be my fresh start, a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened, where the most exciting event was the weekly garbage collection. The real estate agent had promised me peace. She never mentioned the watcher. The first week passed in a blur of cardboard boxes and furniture assembly. I fell into the mindless rhythm of unpacking, grateful for the distraction it provided. But even as I worked, I found my attention drifting toward the front windows, toward the street outside, toward that house. The garage door remained partially open. Always. Morning, noon, night. That 2-foot gap never changed, never closed, never opened further. And within that darkness, I began to discern more clearly the shape I had glimpsed on my first day. A figure, seated, facing my direction. I rationalized it at first. Perhaps my neighbor was an elderly man who enjoyed watching the street. Perhaps he was disabled, or lonely, or simply eccentric. Suburbs bred eccentricity, I told myself. All that sameness, all that enforced conformity, it had to manifest somewhere, didn't it? Maybe sitting in a dim garage and watching the world pass by was his way of rebelling against the beige monotony. But the figure never moved. Not once. Not to stretch. Not to shift position. Not to scratch an itch or check a phone, or do any of the 1,000 small movements that betray the presence of a living body. He, I had decided it was a he, though I couldn't say why, simply sat there, a dark silhouette against darker darkness, facing my house with what I could only describe as patience. The patience of something that had nowhere else to be, nothing else to do, all the time in the world. By the second week, I had developed a routine. Every morning before my coffee had finished brewing, I would approach my living room window and peer through the blinds. And every morning, Without fail, the garage door would be open, the figure would be seated, and I would feel that cold trickle of unease slide down my spine like ice water. I started timing myself. How long could I stand there, watching, before the discomfort became unbearable? At first, it was only seconds, then minutes. I would stand at my window, coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at that unmoving shape while it stared. I was certain it was staring back at me. The neighbors on either side seemed oblivious. I watched them come and go, loading children into minivans, walking dogs along the sidewalk, waving to each other with the practiced friendliness of people who had long ago forgotten how to be genuinely interested in one another. None of them ever glanced at the house across from mine. None of them seemed to notice the perpetually open garage, the seated figure, the wrongness that radiated from that property like heat from sun-baked asphalt. Was I the only one who could see him? The thought arrived unbidden one night as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, listening to the suburban silence that was somehow louder than any city noise I had ever known. Was I imagining this? Had the stress of my move, the weight of everything I had left behind, finally cracked something fundamental in my mind? I got up. I walked to the bedroom window, which faced the street. The moon was full that night, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow, and across the street, the garage door gaped like a wound in the perfect face of the neighborhood. And there, within that darkness, I could see him more clearly than ever before. The shape of shoulders, the suggestion of a head, the absolute terrible stillness of something that was watching me watch it. I closed the curtain so hard the rod nearly came loose from the wall. The third week brought the sounds. It started subtle, so subtle I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. A faint scraping, like a chair being dragged across concrete. It would come at random hours, pulling me from sleep or interrupting my work, always from the direction of that house. I would rush to the window, heart hammering, and see nothing changed. The garage door open, the figure seated, the silence reasserting itself as if the sound had never existed. But then came the knocking. 3 knocks, always 3, soft, almost polite, on my front door. They would come late at night, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning, when the neighborhood was wrapped in the thick blanket of sleep. I would jolt awake, disoriented, certain I had heard something, and lie there in the darkness, straining to hear it again. The first few times I dismissed it as a dream, the sounds of an unfamiliar house settling. But on the 4th night, I was already awake, already standing at my bedroom window with the curtains drawn, when the knocks came. 3 soft taps, patient and deliberate, echoing through my empty house. I did not go to the door. I stood frozen, watching the figure across the street, and I could have sworn, though it was impossible, though the distance and the darkness made certainty impossible, that the shape in the garage had shifted, just slightly, as if it had leaned forward, as if it was waiting to see what I would do. I did nothing. I stood there until the gray light of dawn began to seep into the sky, and only then did I allow myself to breathe, to move, to pretend that everything was normal. The knocking stopped after that night, but something else began. I started finding things on my porch, small things, easily overlooked. A pebble arranged just so on the welcome mat, a single leaf, placed with deliberate precision on the top step, a smudge on my front door, at eye level, as if someone had pressed their forehead against the glass and stayed there long enough to leave a mark. I told myself it was the wind, animals, neighborhood kids playing pranks, but the arrangements were too careful, too intentional, and they always appeared overnight, in those dark hours when the knocking had come, when I huddled in my bed and refused to look outside. Someone was visiting my porch while I slept. Someone was standing at my door, and across the street, the watcher continued his vigil, patient and eternal. I began to research the house. The county records were sparse. Built in 1987, sold twice, no notable history. The online real estate listings showed nothing unusual, just the same bland photographs of beige walls and neutral carpeting that could have belonged to any home in America. But something caught my attention, the listing status. active. The house was for sale. Had been for 8 months according to the timestamp. I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach. I had never seen anyone enter or exit that house. Never seen a car in the driveway. Never seen a light in the windows. Never seen any sign of habitation beyond that open garage and its silent occupant. If the house was empty, if it had been empty for nearly a year, then who was sitting in that garage? Who was watching me? The question consumed me. I stopped unpacking, stopped pretending to establish myself in this new life. I spent my days at the window, documenting every detail of the house across the street. The way the sunlight never seemed to penetrate that garage opening. The way the grass, now that I looked closely, was slightly overgrown despite the neighborhood's obsessive lawn standards. The way the mailbox stood crooked, just barely, as if someone had knocked it askew and no one had bothered to fix it. Small wrongnesses. That's what they were. The kind of details that slide past conscious awareness but lodge themselves somewhere deeper, triggering that ancient alarm system we inherited from ancestors who knew that something slightly off often meant something dangerous. The house was wrong, and yet I couldn't stop looking at it. The decision to confront the situation came on a Sunday morning, bright and ordinary, the kind of day that makes horror feel impossible. I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks, a determination that burned through the fog of sleeplessness and paranoia that had become my constant companions. I was going to walk across the street. I was going to knock on that door. I was going to demand answers. The distance from my front porch to theirs couldn't have been more than 50 feet, but it felt like miles. The neighborhood was quiet, churchgoers gone and late risers still in bed, and my footsteps on the pavement seemed impossibly loud. I kept my eyes fixed on the front door, refusing to look at the garage, refusing to acknowledge the figure I could feel watching me with every step. The porch was dusty, untouched. Dead leaves had gathered in the corners, and a fine layer of grit covered the welcome mat. No one had stood here in months, maybe longer. I knocked 3 times, the same pattern that had invaded my nights. The door opened almost immediately. The man on the other side was younger than I expected, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, a lanyard around his neck bearing the logo of a local real estate company. He smiled the practiced smile of someone who spent their days showing empty houses to skeptical buyers. He informed me cheerfully that the property had been vacant since the previous owner's departure, nearly a year ago. A difficult sell, he confided, gesturing vaguely at the sameness of the neighborhood. He asked if I was interested in viewing the property. I barely heard him. My attention had drifted, almost against my will, toward the garage. The side door was visible from where I stood, hanging slightly ajar. The same garage that had been partially open for weeks, housing its silent occupant. I heard myself asking about the figure, the person in the garage, the one who sat there day and night watching my house. The realtor's smile faltered. He followed my gaze to the garage, his expression shifting from professional friendliness to something more guarded. He told me that there was no one in the garage. He told me that the house had been empty for months and that he had the only key. He suggested, with the careful diplomacy of someone who had encountered difficult neighbors before, that perhaps I had been mistaken. I pushed past him before I could stop myself. The garage was dim, cooler than the morning air outside, and smelled of oil and dust and something else. Something older, mustier, like the breath of a house that had been sealed too long. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I scanned the space with a desperation that bordered on panic. Tools hung on pegboard walls. Cardboard boxes lined the perimeter. A lawnmower sat beneath a tarp. And there, against the far wall, facing the half-open door, facing my house across the street, a chair. A single folding chair positioned with deliberate precision, angled toward the gap in the garage door. Empty, covered in a fine layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been moved in months. But the dust on the seat was disturbed, brushed away, as if someone had been sitting there very, very recently. The realtor's voice reached me from the doorway, asking if everything was all right. I didn't answer. I couldn't stop staring at that chair, at the view it commanded of my front windows, at the intimate angle that would allow someone seated there to watch every movement I made. I went home. I closed my curtains. I sat in my darkened living room and tried to convince myself that the chair meant nothing, that the dust disturbance was a trick of light, that I had imagined everything. But that night, when the knocking came, 3 soft taps, patient as death, I found myself at the window peering through the gap in my curtains. The garage door was open. The chair was visible just barely in the moonlight, and this time, there was someone sitting in it. I watched for hours, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure never stirred, never blinked, never did anything except exist, a dark shape against darker darkness, watching my house with the same terrible patience I had come to know so well. When dawn finally came, and the figure dissolved into the gray morning light, I told myself it had been a shadow, a hallucination, the product of sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination. But as I turned away from the window, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My front door was open, just a crack, just wide enough for someone to slip through. And on the floor of my entryway, arranged with careful precision, lay 3 small pebbles. I live in this house now, or perhaps the house lives in me. I no longer know where its walls end and my thoughts begin. The curtains remain closed. The garage door across the street remains open. And somewhere in the space between certainty and madness, the watcher waits. I don't know if he's real. I don't know if I'm real. But every night when the knocking comes, I find myself rising from my bed, walking toward the door, reaching for the handle. One day I think I'll answer, and maybe then I'll understand what's been watching me all along. Or maybe I'll become the next figure in the chair. Story 12. The light came on the moment I killed my engine. I've been driving rigs for 17 years across this country, through blizzards in Montana and dust storms in Arizona, through stretches of roads so empty they make you forget other people exist. I've seen things that would make most folks nervous. Abandoned cars in the middle of nowhere with doors hanging open, shapes moving in cornfields at 3 in the morning, hitchhikers who vanish when you check your mirrors. You learn to ignore these things. You learn that the highway plays tricks on tired eyes, that isolation does strange things to the mind, that most mysteries have boring explanations. But I never learned to ignore that house. It sits about 40 miles past the state line, down a 2-lane stretch of Route 17 that most truckers avoid because there's nothing out there. No gas stations, no diners, no rest stops for nearly 80 miles. I started taking it 3 months ago when they closed the main corridor for construction. The first time I saw the house, I didn't think much of it. Just an old wooden structure, 2 stories, sitting back from the road maybe 100 yards. The kind of place you see rotting in every rural county in America. Gray boards, sagging porch, windows like hollow eye sockets staring at the empty fields. I remember thinking, someone should tear that thing down. That first night, I pulled onto the shoulder around 2 in the morning. My logbook said I needed to rest, and there was a wide gravel patch there, almost like someone had intended it for parking. The moment my headlights died and the diesel shuddered into silence, a light appeared in the second-floor window of that house. Not a gradual glow, not someone walking through with a flashlight. The window went from black to bright in an instant, like someone had been standing there in the dark, finger on a switch, waiting. I told myself it was a sensor light, motion activated, triggered by my truck pulling over, some security measure for a property that was probably used for storage or occasional weekend visits. I told myself this even though the light was clearly inside the house, warm and yellow, not the harsh white of modern security floods. I told myself this even though there was no driveway, no mailbox, no power lines running to the property. I slept poorly that night. The second time was a week later. Same stretch of road, same gravel patch. It was the only decent place to pull over for miles. I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the light, or misremembered it, the way you do with strange things that happen late at night. But when I stopped, it happened again. Engine off, light on. That same second-floor window glowing like a candle behind dusty glass. This time I got out of the cab. The night was cold. That particular kind of cold you get in these flatland states where there's nothing to stop the wind from cutting straight through you. I stood by my truck, breath fogging in the air, and I watched that window. I don't know what I expected. Movement, maybe. A silhouette. Some sign of human presence that would explain the light and let me dismiss the whole thing as a farmer with insomnia or a squatter keeping warm. Nothing moved. The light just burned, steady and patient. I stayed there for maybe 5 minutes before the cold drove me back inside. When I woke up 4 hours later, the light was off. The house looked dead again, just an old pile of lumber waiting to collapse. I didn't pull over there again for 2 weeks. The third time was an accident. I'd pushed too hard, trying to make a delivery deadline that was already impossible. And when my eyes started doing that thing where the road seems to breathe and the lines start to slither, I knew I had to stop. I didn't realize where I was until I'd already killed the engine, until the light came on. That night, I did something I still can't fully explain. I pulled out my phone and took a picture. The screen showed the house clearly in the moonlight, every warped board and broken shutter visible, but the window was dark. I looked up. The light was there, warm and yellow, plain as anything. I looked at my phone. Nothing. Just black glass reflecting the night sky. I took 6 more pictures. Same result every time. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my cab with the doors locked, watching that light, waiting for something to change. Around 4 in the morning, it simply went off. No dimming, no flicker. Just there, and then not there. I should have found another route. I know that now. But there was something about the mystery of it, the wrongness of it, that I couldn't leave alone. I've always been that way. My ex-wife used to say I'd pick at a scab until I hit bone. She wasn't wrong. So I kept stopping there. Night after night, whenever my schedule brought me down that stretch of Route 17, I started keeping notes. The light always came on within 3 seconds of my engine stopping. It was always in the same window. It never flickered, never dimmed, never changed color or intensity. There were never any cars in the overgrown yard, never any footprints in the weedy gravel, never any smoke from the chimney even on the coldest nights. I found a pair of binoculars at a truck stop and spent an entire night scanning every window of that house, looking for any sign of occupation. Nothing. Just that one light, burning like a vigil candle for something I couldn't name. Then the messages started. It was a Thursday. I remember because I just missed my daughter's school play, and I was feeling that particular kind of emptiness that comes from choosing work over family one too many times. I'd pulled into my usual spot, watched the light come on, and was settling into sleep when my CB radio crackled to life. I kept it on out of habit more than necessity. Most truckers have switched to cell phones and apps, but I liked the static, the occasional voices cutting through the night. It made the loneliness feel less absolute. The voice came through clear, which was strange because these flatlands played hell with radio signals. Clear but not quite right. Too flat, too even, like someone reading from a script they didn't understand. "You're parked on the shoulder," it said. "Gravel patch. Mile marker 43. I grabbed the handset, heart suddenly loud in my ears. "Who is this? What channel are you on?" Silence. Then, "You're in the driver's seat. Blue shirt. Left hand on the wheel." I looked down. Blue shirt. Left hand resting on the wheel where I'd left it. I jerked it away like I'd touched something hot. "Who the hell is this?" "You're scared now," the voice said. "Your breathing changed. Faster. Shallower." I killed the radio, ripped the power cord right out of the dash. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the ignition key. I started the truck and drove. Didn't stop until I was 200 miles away, parked in a busy lot behind a brightly lit gas station, surrounded by other trucks and people and all the comforting evidence of normal life. I told myself it was a prank. Some bored kid with a powerful transmitter, maybe watching the road through a telescope, getting his kicks scaring truckers. It made sense. It was possible. I almost believed it. But that voice. There was something in that voice that made the explanation feel like a lie I was telling myself to keep from screaming. I switched routes. For 3 weeks, I took the long way around, adding 2 hours to my trips and eating into my already thin margins. My dispatcher was unhappy. My bank account was unhappier. But I slept better, and the nightmares started to fade. Dreams of that yellow light, of a voice describing my every movement in a tone as flat and cold as highway asphalt. Then the construction ended. The main corridor reopened. I had no more excuses to take Route 17. Except I couldn't stop thinking about it. That house, that light, that voice. I'd lie awake in motel rooms and rest stops, staring at the ceiling, asking myself questions I couldn't answer. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? Had 17 years of solitude and sleep deprivation finally cracked something fundamental in my brain? I needed to know. I needed to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation, or I needed to accept that there wasn't and deal with whatever that meant about me or the world. So I went back. The house looked the same. Of course it did. I pulled onto that gravel patch at 2:47 a.m., and the light came on at 2:47 and 3 seconds, right on schedule. I'd brought a new radio this time, one I'd picked up at an electronics store and never told anyone about. Clean frequencies, no way for anyone to know what channel I was monitoring. For an hour, nothing happened. I sat there, watching the light, listening to static, starting to feel foolish, starting to hope that whatever had happened before was a one-time thing, a glitch, a moment of weirdness that I could file away and forget. Then the static changed. It didn't resolve into a voice right away. First came sounds, a creak like footsteps on old floorboards, the dry whisper of fabric moving, a rhythm that might have been breathing. I turned up the volume, straining to hear, and the sounds grew clearer but no more identifiable, like I was listening to a room where something was happening just out of earshot. Then the voice. Same flat tone, same wrong cadence. You came back. I didn't answer. I was afraid that if I spoke, it would prove something I wasn't ready to accept. You're holding the radio in your right hand. Your thumb is on the talk button, but you're not pressing it. You want to say something, but you don't know what. I dropped the radio like it had stung me. It bounced off the seat and landed on the floor, still crackling with that terrible static. You're looking at the window now. Second floor. You're wondering if there's someone inside, if there's a face behind the glass. But you can't see anything, can you? Just the light. I was shaking. Full body tremors like I had a fever. I couldn't look away from that window. Couldn't make myself start the truck and drive. Couldn't do anything but sit there and listen. You'll come back again, the voice said. You always do. People like you. You can't leave things alone. You pick and pick until you find what's underneath. What do you think is underneath? The radio went silent. Not even static now. Just dead air. Thick and heavy. I don't remember driving away. I don't remember the next 50 miles. I came back to myself at a crossroads, engine idling. No idea how I'd gotten there, or how long I'd been sitting at the stop sign. The sun was coming up. My coffee was cold. My logbook showed a gap of 3 hours I couldn't account for. That was 6 weeks ago. I still drive. I still take Route 17 sometimes, when the schedules demand it. I don't stop at that gravel patch anymore. I don't even slow down when I pass the house. But every time, every single time, I look in my side mirror as it recedes behind me. And every time there's a light in that second floor window, even in broad daylight, even when the sun is high and bright and there's no reason for any light to be visible at all. Sometimes I hear things on my radio, fragments, half words that might be static or might be something else, descriptions of places I'm going to be before I get there, references to things I've done that no one saw. Once, a full minute of what sounded like my own breathing, played back to me through speakers I'd checked 3 times for bugs or tampering. I've started to wonder if it matters whether the house is real. I've started to wonder if something can be watching you, even if there's no one there to watch. If attention itself can be a kind of presence. If isolation doesn't just affect the mind, but changes something more fundamental, opens a door or builds one. or reveals one that was always there. I've started to wonder if the house was ever empty at all, or if I was the one who was empty, and now I'm not. Last week I drove past at midday. I made myself look directly at the house instead of using the mirror. The windows were dark, the porch was sagging. It looked exactly like what it was, an abandoned structure slowly returning to the earth. But there was a truck parked on the gravel patch, an 18-wheeler similar to mine, engine off, curtains drawn in the cab. I almost stopped. I almost got out and knocked on the door, warned whoever was inside about the light and the voice and the things that happen when you stay too long. Instead, I kept driving, because part of me, a part that grows larger every day, wasn't sure if the truck was really there. Wasn't sure if anything I see on that stretch of road is really there. And a bigger part of me, a part I don't like to examine too closely, wondered if the voice on the radio wasn't coming from the house at all. Maybe it's been coming from me. Maybe I'm the one watching. I keep finding myself in places I don't remember driving to. Gravel patches, shoulders of empty roads, parked outside houses with dark windows, engine off, waiting for lights to come on. Last night, I woke up in my cab and my hand was on the CB handset, and there was a voice, my voice, describing the interior of another truck somewhere. The color of the driver's shirt, the way his breathing changed when he realized he wasn't alone. I put the radio down. I drove away. But before I did, I looked in the mirror. The light was on. It's always on now. I'm still driving, still watching, still wondering what's real and what's just the road talking, the way it does after too many years and too many miles. Sometimes I think I should stop driving, stop looking, stop listening to the voices that might be outside, or might be inside, or might be something else entirely. But I can't, because someone has to watch the watchers. Someone has to keep the light on, don't they? Story 13. The highway stretched before me like a black ribbon unspooling into nothing. I had been driving for 7 hours, maybe 8. Time had become unreliable somewhere around the Arizona border, dissolving into the monotony of headlights carving through darkness and the occasional flicker of distant lightning that never brought rain. I should have stopped in Flagstaff. I knew that even then, gripping the steering wheel while my eyelids grew heavier with each passing mile marker. But something about the desert at night had always called to me, that vast emptiness, where the sky pressed down so close you could almost taste the stars. I told myself I'd find somewhere soon, just a few more miles. The motel appeared without warning. One moment there was nothing but sagebrush and shadow, and then my headlights swept across a faded sign. Desert Vista Motor Lodge, vacancy. The neon flickered in that dying way old signs do, the V in Vista dark, making it read like a warning I was too tired to heed. A single-story building sprawled behind it, maybe 12 units. Their doors painted a turquoise that might have been cheerful in 1962, but now looked like the color of something drowned. I pulled into the gravel lot, and the crunch of stones beneath my tires sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. No other cars, no lights in any windows except for the office, where a pale glow seeped through yellowed blinds. The night air hit me when I stepped out. Not cool exactly, but different, thicker. It carried a smell I couldn't identify, something organic and old, like the inside of a museum or my grandmother's closet after she passed. I stood there for a moment, stretching my back, and noticed how the silence seemed to have weight. No insects, no distant traffic. Even my own breathing sounded muffled, as if the desert itself was holding something in. The office door stuck when I pushed it, then gave way with a groan that made my teeth ache. Inside, wood paneling the color of weak coffee covered every wall, and a rotating fan on the counter moved air that had given up being cool decades ago. Behind the desk sat a man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts. Long arms, too thin neck, eyes that seemed to be looking at something just past my shoulder. He smiled when I approached, and I noticed his teeth were very small. "Long drive," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, reaching for my wallet. Just need a room for a few hours, maybe until 6 or 7. The clerk, his name tag read host, which struck me as odd, slid a registration card across the counter. The paper felt wrong, too smooth, almost slick. As I filled it out, I became aware that he was humming something under his breath, a tune that seemed familiar but that I couldn't quite place. It made my handwriting shake. "Room 7, he said, handing me a key. An actual metal key, not a card. End of the building, quiet. I thanked him and turned to leave, but his voice stopped me at the door. "The television doesn't work," he said, "but sometimes it turns on anyway. Don't watch it." I looked back at him, waiting for some indication that he was joking. His face offered nothing. "Okay," I said, because what else could I say? Room 7 smelled like dust, and something sweeter underneath. Flowers, maybe, or the chemical ghost of old air freshener. The bedspread was that peculiar orange-brown that motels everywhere seemed to favor in another era, and when I sat on the mattress, it wheezed beneath me like a tired animal. The bathroom fixtures were avocado green. A painting of a desert sunset hung crooked above the headboard, and no matter how I adjusted it, it wouldn't hang straight. I was tired enough that none of this mattered. I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle out of habit I'd developed driving cross-country alone, and collapsed onto the bed without undressing. Sleep came fast, a dark wave that pulled me under before I could even close my eyes properly. I dreamed of corridors, long, narrow passages that stretched in directions that geometry shouldn't allow, walls the color of old bone, ceilings that pressed lower with each step I took. Someone was walking behind me. I could hear their footsteps, always exactly out of sync with my own, as if they were stepping into the spaces between my steps. I wanted to turn around, but I knew, the way you know things in dreams, that turning would be a mistake, that seeing what followed would change something fundamental, something I couldn't take back. When I woke, the room was different. I noticed it gradually, the way you notice a headache that's been building for hours. The light coming through the curtains was wrong, not the soft gray of early morning, but something brighter, harsher. I checked my phone, 10:47 a.m. I'd slept almost 7 hours instead of the 3 I'd planned. But that wasn't what made my stomach clench. The ceiling had water stains that hadn't been there before, brown blooms spreading across the plaster like continents on a strange map. The painting above the bed was gone, replaced by a darker rectangle where it had protected the wallpaper from fading, and the wallpaper itself. I could have sworn it had been a pale floral pattern, but now it showed vertical stripes, yellow and gray, peeling at the seams. I sat up slowly, and the mattress spring screamed in a way I didn't remember from the night before. Older, more corroded. The chair I'd wedged under the door handle was still there, but the door itself had changed. The paint was no longer turquoise but a faded brown, and the wood showed deep cracks that looked like they'd been weathering for years. A cold certainty crept over me. I was still dreaming. I had to be. This was one of those false awakenings, layers of sleep nested inside each other like those Russian dolls my mother used to collect. I pinched the soft skin inside my elbow, hard enough to bruise, and felt every nerve ending light up with pain. Not dreaming then, or dreaming in a way I couldn't wake from. I got up and checked the bathroom. The avocado fixtures were still there, but they were covered in a film of dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. The mirror above the sink was cracked in a spiderweb pattern radiating from the center, and when I looked into it, my reflection seemed to lag behind my movements by just a fraction of a second, long enough to notice, short enough to doubt. I turned the faucet. Nothing came out. The pipes didn't even groan. Back in the main room, I noticed something I'd missed before. A faint pattern of footprints in the dust on the floor, leading from the door to the bed. They looked like mine, same size, same tread pattern from my sneakers. But there was another set beneath them, older and fainter, heading in the opposite direction, toward the door, toward leaving. But I hadn't left. I'd slept straight through until now. I gathered my things, keys, wallet, phone, and tried not to look too closely at anything else as I made my way outside. The sun hit me like a physical force, and for a moment I just stood there blinking, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The motel looked abandoned, not just old, not just neglected, but truly forsaken. The office window was shattered, blind hanging at a crazy angle. Weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot that hadn't existed last night. The sign, Desert Vista Motor Lodge, was no longer flickering because it was no longer lit. Half the letters had fallen off entirely, leaving only D. Ert Fiesta, and my car was covered in a layer of red desert dust so thick that I couldn't see through the windows. My hands trembled as I wiped the driver's side windshield with my sleeve. The dust came away in rusty streaks, and I had the sudden, irrational thought that it looked like dried blood. But that was ridiculous, the product of too little sleep and too much strangeness. I got in, turned the key, and felt a surge of relief when the engine caught on the first try. The dashboard clock read 10:52 a.m. My phone agreed, though I noticed with unease that I had no signal. Not unusual in the desert, but the bars weren't just low, they were absent entirely, replaced by a small icon I didn't recognize. An hourglass, maybe, or something emptying. I pulled out of the lot faster than I should have, gravel spraying behind me, and didn't look in the rearview mirror until I reached the highway. When I finally did, the motel was exactly where I'd left it, a sagging, decrepit structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I drove. The GPS took several minutes to acquire satellites, and when it finally did, the map showed my location on a stretch of highway I didn't remember. Route 66, it said, which made no sense. I hadn't been anywhere near Route 66, or at least I didn't think I had. I zoomed out, looking for the motel, for any marker that might explain where I'd spent the night. Nothing. I scrolled through nearby points of interest. Gas stations, rest stops, campgrounds. No Desert Vista Motor Lodge. No motor lodge of any kind within 50 miles. The road I was on appeared empty on the satellite view. Just an unbroken line through tan and brown terrain. No buildings, no signs, no evidence that anyone had ever stopped here. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through engineering school and 16 years in a career built on logic and verifiable data, began constructing explanations. The motel was too small to be on GPS. The satellite imagery was outdated. I had been more tired than I realized and had hallucinated the decay, the age, the wrongness. Sleep deprivation could do that. I'd read studies. The brain, desperate for rest, could fabricate entire scenarios, blend dreams with reality until the seams disappeared. But even as I assembled these explanations, I knew they didn't fit. The dust on my car was real. I could feel the grit of it between my fingers. The key to room 7 was still in my pocket. I'd forgotten to leave it at the desk. I pulled it out and looked at it while keeping one eye on the empty road. The metal was tarnished, almost black with age, and the plastic tag attached to it was cracked and brittle. The number 7 had been worn away until it was barely visible. Last night, that key had been shiny. New. The tag had been white plastic, not yellowed and brittle. I looked up at the road just in time to see something in my peripheral vision. A figure standing at the edge of the asphalt, watching me pass. I turned my head, but by the time I looked, there was nothing. Just rocks and sand and the wavering heat that rose from the highway like something breathing. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I turned on the radio, desperate for anything. Music, voices, the crackle of distant stations. But there was only static, not ordinary static either. It had a rhythm to it, a pattern that almost resolved into words before dissolving again. I turned it off and drove in silence. 20 minutes later, I passed a highway sign, now leaving Arizona. I didn't remember entering Arizona. I didn't remember much about the drive at all, I realized. Just fragments, impressions, the sense of miles passing beneath me without actually being present for them. I pulled over at the first rest stop I found, a concrete building with peeling paint and a single vending machine buzzing in the heat. There was one other car in the lot, a station wagon with wood paneling that looked like it had rolled out of 1979. No driver visible. Inside, the restroom was empty. I splashed water on my face. cold enough to shock me into something like clarity, and stared at my reflection in the scratched metal mirror. I looked tired, dark circles under my eyes, skin the color of old paper, but I looked like myself. That was something. On my way out, I noticed a bulletin board covered in flyers. Missing pets, local church events, advertisements for businesses that probably no longer existed. One flyer caught my attention, and I stopped. "Have you seen this building?" The headline read. Below it was a grainy black and white photograph of a motel, long and low, single story, doors painted dark. It could have been any roadside lodge from any decade, but something about the shape of it, the way the sign jutted up at an angle. I leaned closer. The text below the photograph was faded, barely legible. Multiple travelers have reported staying at a motel matching this description on the night of date illegible, only to find no evidence of its existence the following morning. If you have experienced anything similar, please contact number illegible immediately. Do not return to the location. Do not attempt to find it again. The paper felt old, not vintage old, but fragile, as if it had been hanging there for years, decades, fading in the sun that streamed through the windows. The corners were curled, the edges brown, but the staple that held it to the board was shiny and new. I tore the flyer down and shoved it in my pocket without thinking. When I got back to my car, the station wagon was gone. I hadn't heard it leave. The rest of the drive should have taken 4 hours. My GPS said 3.5. I arrived in less than 2 somehow, the clock on my phone jumping forward in increments I couldn't account for, miles disappearing beneath me without the time to match. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that made me think of that motel sign, that dying neon, that word, vacancy, flickering like a heartbeat. I sat in my car for a long time, engine off, watching the shadows lengthen across my lawn. My house looked exactly as I'd left it. The porch light was on, the automatic timer working as intended. My neighbor's dog was barking in the yard next door, a sound so ordinary it almost hurt. But something was different. Not in the house. In me. I could feel it when I moved, a slight delay between intention and action, as if my body was receiving signals from very far away. The key to room 7 was still in my pocket, and when I touched it, the metal was cold, impossibly cold for something that had been pressed against my body for hours. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with every light on, the television playing nothing I could focus on, and waited for something I couldn't name. Around 3 a.m., I heard a sound from the guest bedroom, a creak like weight settling on old springs. I didn't investigate. At 4 a.m., I finally pulled out the flyer from the rest stop and unfolded it on my coffee table. The photograph was still there, grainy and indistinct, but now I could see something I'd missed before. A figure in one of the windows, small, dark, watching. I looked at it for a long time. Then I folded the paper carefully and put it back in my pocket. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking up motels on Route 66, searching for something I know I won't find, something the maps insist doesn't exist. The key is still in my drawer. I can't bring myself to throw it away. It's warmer now than it was, almost body temperature, as if something is slowly waking up inside it. Last week I found dust on my pillow. Red desert dust, fine as powder, in a pattern that almost looked like footprints. I don't know if I ever really left that room. I don't know if I ever really checked in. The only thing I know for certain is this. Somewhere out there, on a highway that doesn't exist, a neon sign is flickering. The V is dark. There's always a vacancy. And something is waiting for me to come back. Story 14. The smell hit me before I even turned the key. Brine. Salt. The unmistakable rot of kelp left too long under a merciless sun. I stood on the porch of my new home, a weather-beaten Victorian sitting alone at the edge of a town that had forgotten its own name, and breathed in the impossible. Behind me stretched nothing but cracked earth, sagebrush, and a horizon that shimmered with heat. The nearest ocean was 800 miles away. I told myself it was the previous owner, some eccentric who'd kept aquariums maybe. Fish tanks left to fester. The realtor had mentioned the old man had lived here alone for 40 years, and when they found him, he'd been sitting in his armchair facing the window, eyes fixed on something in the distance that no one else could see. Natural causes, they said. His heart had simply stopped, as if it had grown tired of beating. The price had been absurd. $32,000 for a 3-bedroom house with original hardwood floors and a wraparound porch. I should have known. I should have asked more questions. But I was running from a life that had collapsed around me, a failed marriage, a career that had dissolved like morning fog, a city that held nothing but reminders of everything I'd lost. I wanted silence. I wanted emptiness. I wanted to disappear into the blank spaces of the American interior and rebuild myself from nothing. The smell faded by morning. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The first week passed in a haze of unpacking and small repairs. The house was old but solid, its bones good despite decades of neglect. I replaced rotted boards on the porch, scrubbed years of grime from the windows, painted over the strange watermarks that bloomed across the walls in patterns I tried not to examine too closely. The town, if you could call it that, consisted of a general store, a post office that opened 3 days a week, and a bar called the Dust Bowl that served the same 6 regulars every night. I introduced myself to no one. They didn't seem surprised. At night I sat on the porch and watched the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, drinking beer that grew warm in my hand, listening to the wind whisper through the sage. The silence here was absolute, a living thing that pressed against my eardrums. I'd wanted this. I reminded myself. This was healing. This was peace. Then came the 7th night. I woke at 3:17 a.m. I remember the time exactly because I stared at the glowing numbers on my phone for what felt like hours, trying to understand what had pulled me from sleep. The room was dark, the air thick and heavy. And then I smelled it again. The sea. Not a hint this time, not a trace, but a full assault. Salt and brine and something deeper, something organic and ancient. The smell of depths where sunlight never reaches. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The smell was so strong I could taste it, coating my tongue with mineral sharpness. I fumbled for the lamp, and when the light flooded the room, I saw them. The walls were weeping. Not water, not exactly. Something thicker, darker, leaving trails down the faded wallpaper like tear tracks on an old woman's face. I watched, frozen, as one droplet slid down to the floor and pooled there, glistening. In the silence, I could hear a sound, faint, rhythmic, like breathing, like waves. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the walls were dry, the smell was gone, and I found myself wondering if I'd dreamed the whole thing. Stress, I told myself, the isolation playing tricks on an already fragile mind. I made coffee, sat on the porch, watched the sun bleach the world to bone, but when I went back inside, I found a wet footprint on the hardwood floor. Bare, larger than mine, leading from the bedroom toward the back of the house, where an old door I'd assumed led to a closet stood slightly ajar. The door opened onto a staircase I hadn't noticed during my initial walkthrough. Narrow wooden steps descended into darkness, and from below rose a smell so thick it was almost solid. Not just brine now, but something else. Something alive. I told myself I should get a flashlight, told myself I should call someone, told myself that going down those stairs alone was exactly what the fool in every horror movie does right before the credits roll. But something pulled at me, a curiosity that felt more like compulsion, and before I'd made a conscious decision, my foot was on the first step. The stairs went down further than they should have. The house had no basement. I'd checked the property records, examined the foundation, but I counted 37 steps before the darkness gave way to a dim, phosphorescent glow, and by then I knew that whatever waited below had nothing to do with basements or architecture or anything that belonged in the rational world I'd always believed in. The space that opened before me was vast and impossible. The walls glistened with moisture, covered in something that looked like coral but pulsed faintly with inner light. The floor was sand, actual sand, damp and cold beneath my bare feet. And in the center of the room, taking up most of the space, was a pool of black water that reflected nothing, not even the strange light that emanated from the walls. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The water was still, utterly still, but I could feel movement in it. A presence, massive and patient, waiting just beneath the surface. I thought of deep-sea creatures, the kind that live in trenches so far down that they've never known light. I thought of old gods sleeping in sunken cities. I thought of how small I was, how fragile, how easy it would be for something to reach up from that darkness and pull me under. I ran. I ran up those 37 steps and slammed the door behind me and pushed the heaviest furniture I could find against it. Then I sat in the kitchen until dawn, watching that door, waiting for something to push through. Nothing came. But when I finally moved the furniture and opened the door again, there were no stairs. Just a shallow closet, empty except for dust and a faint smell of salt. I should have left then. Any sane person would have. But something kept me rooted. Stubbornness, maybe. Or the suspicion that whatever was happening would follow me wherever I went. You can't outrun something that lives inside your own mind. The manifestations continued, growing stronger each night. The smell of the sea became a constant presence, fading during the day to a whisper, but returning each evening like a tide I couldn't see. The water stains on the walls spread, and no matter how many times I painted over them, they returned, always in the same shapes, handprints that seemed to press through from the other side, reaching for something, reaching for me. I started hearing things. At first, just the sound of water, the gentle lap of waves, so faint I could convince myself it was just wind in the eaves or blood rushing through my own ears. But soon the sounds grew clearer, more distinct. I heard gulls crying at 3 a.m, their shrieks piercing and desperate. I heard the creak of wood, like the hull of an old ship straining against pressure. I heard voices sometimes, low and murmuring, speaking in languages I couldn't identify, words that slipped away the moment I tried to grasp them. And through it all, the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake it. Every room I entered, I felt eyes on me, tracking my movements. I'd spin around, certain I'd catch someone standing in the doorway, but there was never anyone there. Just the house, settling around me like something alive. Just the smell of salt and the sound of water and the growing certainty that I was not alone. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. Dates, times, the exact nature of each phenomenon. I photographed the water stains, recorded the sounds on my phone, measured the humidity in each room with a meter I ordered online. I was looking for patterns, for explanations, for anything that would anchor these experiences to something concrete and understandable. What I found instead was a consistency that terrified me. The activity peaked at 3:17 a.m. every night. The humidity in the house rose to 89% after dark, despite the air outside being bone dry. The photographs I took of the walls showed nothing but faded wallpaper, even when my eyes insisted the handprints were right there, pressing through, reaching. I stopped leaving the house. I stopped answering the door when the delivery driver brought the groceries I ordered online. I stopped checking my email, stopped calling the few friends I had left, stopped engaging with any world beyond these walls. The house had become my entire universe, a sealed chamber where the normal rules no longer applied. I told myself I was investigating, gathering evidence, preparing to understand. But in truth, I was waiting for something to reveal itself, waiting for the ocean to finally break through. The night it happened, the night everything changed, began like all the others. I lay in bed, watching the clock tick toward 3:17, my body tense with anticipation. The smell of the sea was overwhelming, filling my lungs with every breath. The walls had begun to sweat hours ago, those handprints emerging from the wallpaper like old photographs developing in chemical baths. When the clock hit 3:17, the sound of waves crashed through the house, not the distant whisper I'd grown accustomed to. This was the roar of a storm surge, the thunder of water breaking against stone. I covered my ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside me, vibrating through my bones, shaking loose memories I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten they existed. I thought of my mother, dead 10 years now, how she'd always said the sea was calling her back. I thought of the beach we'd visited when I was young, how she'd walked into the water and kept walking, how I'd had to run after her and pull her back to shore. She'd looked at me then with eyes that weren't quite hers, and said something I'd never understood. The house remembers. It always remembers. The bedroom door burst open, water poured through. Dark water, cold water, carrying with it the smell of depths and the taste of eternity. It rose around my bed, lifting the furniture, spinning the lamp in lazy circles. I scrambled to my feet, gasping, certain I was going to drown in my own bedroom in a desert town 800 miles from any ocean. And then I saw her. She stood in the doorway, or something that had once been a woman stood there, her form wavering like light through deep water. Her hair floated around her face in invisible currents. Her skin had the gray-green pallor of something long drowned. Her eyes were open, fixed on me, and they were empty. Not just empty of iris or pupil, but empty of everything. Black holes that led down into depths I couldn't fathom. She raised one hand and pressed it against the wall beside her. The handprint matched exactly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I understood in that moment with a clarity that transcended language or logic. This house had been built on something, over something. Something that existed before the desert was a desert, before the sea retreated and left this land to bake under an indifferent sun. Something had lived here once, was living here still, in dimensions my mind couldn't process, in tides that rose and fell according to rhythms older than humanity. And I had moved in. I had claimed this space. I had made myself part of its pattern. The water reached my chest. I could feel it pulling at me, currents I couldn't see dragging me toward that figure in the doorway. Her hand was still extended now, reaching for me, those empty eyes fixed on mine with something that might have been hunger or might have been loneliness, or might have been nothing at all, just the automatic motion of something that had forgotten what it was. I heard myself speak, words I didn't choose, in a language I didn't know. And then it stopped. The water was gone. The woman was gone. I stood alone in my bedroom, dry, shaking, the taste of salt still sharp on my tongue. Dawn was breaking outside my window, painting the desert in shades of gold and rust. I walked through the house, checking every room. Everything was exactly as it had been. The walls were dry. The air smelled of nothing but dust and age. If there had ever been an ocean here, it had retreated back to wherever impossible oceans go. But when I looked in the mirror, I noticed something that made me grip the edge of the sink until my knuckles went white. My eyes. They looked different somehow, darker, deeper, and for just a moment, just a single terrible moment, I thought I saw water moving in their depths. I'm still here. That was 3 weeks ago, and I'm still here. I tell myself I should leave. Every morning I pack a bag and walk to the door and stand there with my hand on the knob, ready to step out into the desert and never look back. But something stops me. It's not fear, or not just fear. It's the growing suspicion that leaving wouldn't matter. That whatever is here has already become part of me, or I've become part of it, and no amount of distance can separate us now. The manifestations continue, though they've changed. I no longer wake to crashing waves or weeping walls. Now I wake to silence, perfect, absolute silence, and the feeling of pressure all around me, as if the air itself has become water, as if I'm already submerged and have simply forgotten how to notice. The handprints on the walls have faded, but sometimes I see them on my own skin, appearing briefly when I step out of the shower, vanishing before I can look closely. And the woman. I see her sometimes, in reflections, in the corner of my eye. Never directly, never clearly. Just a flicker of gray-green skin, a drift of floating hair, eyes that are empty and hungry and waiting. I've started dreaming of the ocean. Every night now, I walk along a shore that doesn't exist, listening to waves break against sand made of ground bones. The water is warm and welcoming, And in my dreams, I want nothing more than to wade in, to let it close over my head, to sink down into depths where the light never reaches and something vast and patient waits to embrace me. I wake from these dreams with salt water on my lips and sand between my toes. I don't know anymore if I'm haunted or hallucinating, if this house has infected me with its impossible geography, or if I came here already broken, already drowning in my own mind. I don't know if the ocean I smell is real or remembered, if the woman I see is a ghost or a projection of my own fracturing psyche. I don't know if I'm the victim here or somehow the cause, if my presence awakened something that had been sleeping, or if I'm simply the latest in a long line of people who came to this house seeking emptiness and found the opposite instead. What I know is this. Tonight, at 3:17 a.m., I'm going to stop running. I'm going to walk to that closet door, the one that leads nowhere and everywhere, and I'm going to open it. If the stairs are there, I'm going to descend them. I'm going to walk into that impossible room with its coral walls and black water, and I'm going to let whatever lives in that pool see me clearly for the first time. Maybe it will pull me under. Maybe I'll finally understand what's been happening in this house, what my mother meant all those years ago, why the sea has been calling to me my entire life, even though I've spent it running as far from water as I could get. Or maybe I'll open that door and find nothing but an empty closet and the smell of dust, and I'll have to accept that the ocean has always been inside me, rising and falling with tides I can't control, threatening to drown me from within. Either way, at least I'll finally know. The clock on my phone reads 3:15. I can already smell the salt.